Hello everybody, welcome to a comprehensive look at the 1.0 version of Elden Ring. Over the last year and a half, I've been exploring the entirety of the lands between in this version in order to find as many differences as I can from the final product we received, giving us valuable insight into the late stages of development of this game. Be it new dialogue, areas being nearly unrecognizable, cut enemy attacks, completely cut enemy designs, you're bound to learn something new. If you watch my original serialized videos, be assured that there will be loads of new information, as there was a lot to correct, add, not to mention polish, from those original videos. So I hope you learned something new and enjoy it as well. For the uninitiated, what is this 1.0 version? This is the version of a game that is printed into the physical discs that you can buy at stores or have shipped to your home. In order to be ready for the actual launch of the game, these are printed and shipped to stores way ahead of time. But in this day and age, the development period for a game doesn't quite end when these are printed. These days, developers continue development for a little while longer, and simply use the internet for people to download a day one patch, which can be installed as an additional update in your console, and generally completes the game. It is absolutely used as a crutch by developers and publishers at times, likely most of the time, but I won't get into the issues with that today. It is beyond the scope of this video. To have a full understanding of how much time there was from the 1.0 version of the game being finalized until the day one patch was completed and game released, I decided to do some digging. I took a look at my disk for any information on the printing or shipping of it. These numbers here led me to a website called Prospero Patches, which seems to catalog not only when PlayStation 5 games receive patches, but seemingly even some information on the 1.0 disk information itself. The creation date could mean the disk, or it could simply mean when the page for Elden Ring was created. Since the version shipped to disk must have been completed before it was printed regardless, and I'm assuming they didn't simply predict that the game was going to be printed a day prior to when they received the information, they must have known ahead of time. So I'm going to deduce that the date the 1.0 version of the game was printed was December 12th, 2021, at the very latest. They also have a segment for the EU and Japanese printing, but the dates were exactly the same. This is backed up with some online scouting that I did. In an interview with Famitsu on October 3rd, 2021, From Software producer Yasuhiro Kitao confirmed that Elden Ring was at the ending stages of development. 15 days later, on October 18th, there was an official announcement of a final Elden Ring delay from January 22nd, 2022 to February 25th. In our research, I found out it's virtually unheard of for disc versions of a game to be printed prior to even last-minute delays, with only one infamous exception. There's no news of the printing until after the Prospero Patches dates mentioned before, when a Twitter page that announces PlayStation game download sizes states that Elden Ring's download size before day one patch will be 44.472 gigabytes. On December 21st, 2021. The actual file size is slightly off, being 44.52 gigabytes, at least for a US PS5 disc like mine, but I believe that's close enough to say that it's credible. I'm no expert on disk space or anything of the sort, but I'm willing to bet there's plenty of reasons this could be off by such a small amount. Even if this isn't accurate, we're more concerned on when the 1.0 version was finished rather than the actual date of printing. And finally, on January 24th, 2022, From Software announced on a Taipei game show that Elden Ring has finally gone gold, which is simply fancy talk for saying that the 1.0 version was finalized and submitted to be printed. Of course, this has a different meaning than it did back in the day, when game developers couldn't patch the game after it was already out, unless they made an updated print of it, and or for a region that was getting the game at a later date. As mentioned before, developers will usually still work on a game for some time after the disc starts printing. So now let's quickly figure out when the day one patch was finalized, to know roughly how many extra days of development they had. The Prospero website updates on a 1.01 patch on February 3rd, 2022. Then, the PlayStation Game Sites Twitter announces the size of the 1.01 patch on February 14th. Of course, the game launches on February 25th, 2022, and obviously don't need to finish it before the actual release date. This one is a little more nebulous to nail down than the 1.0 patch, since they could have simply been informed of the day one patch on February 3rd, and not finished until later. But since it's the best we got, let's safely say that February 3rd is indeed the day that the 1.01 patch was finalized. If you disagree with my assessment, I've provided enough information for you to come to your own conclusion. But with my chosen dates, it would seem that From Software had around 53 days to finish touching up the game before the world got to officially play it with their own hands. Once we're done with today's video, I'll definitely bring this number up once more so you can judge for yourself if it's a reasonable amount of time with all the types of changes we're gonna see. Now I feel like some of you may be wondering, who would even play this version of the game? The answer is, well, more people than you'd expect. I've received countless comments when I did this series of people playing the 1.0 version as their first experience, usually because they have weak to non-existent internet. 8 gigabytes isn't negligible if your speed is in the single digits after all. And imagine needing to wait potentially days for an update of a game after you already have the disc ready to go. Unfortunately, good internet speeds are still a commodity, even in major countries. As for myself, the reason I dove into this version for a short while is for speedrunning, as I didn't have a good enough GPU at the time to run it on PC. So I checked out the 1.0 version of the PS5 to see if it's feasible, and I very quickly found out it's not, at least if following the exact PC route back then, which was essentially the inception of this whole series. Before we get started properly, here are a few things you should know about the format of the video. When I'm talking about the 1.0 version of the game, I'll refer to it as so, though I may rarely refer to it as disc version, but there will be a 1.00 label at the top right of the video when showing footage of that version. When referring to any other version, I'll usually refer to it as release, and will have a release tag in the top right, as most of the changes from 1.0 were introduced as soon as the day 1 patch, but I may occasionally say post-release. Or perhaps I'll point to a specific patch for some instances, but ultimately you may consider them interchangeable, unless I specifically say otherwise. Secondly, I've created a Google spreadsheet alongside this video that will be massively helpful, especially if you plan to actually play the 1.0 version yourself, which I'm calling the Elden Ring 1.0 companion sheet. It has a lot of raw data and information that's already in the video, but making it easier to browse, or just info that I didn't find interesting enough to bring up in the video. The main use of it will be for any item that has had their location changed, either physically on a map or say a vendor. Though I likely noted most of them on the video itself, I figured it'd be handy having it in list form as well. It likely won't be complete by the release of the video. I'll keep working on it for a few weeks after it's out, especially if more information is brought to me, but it should still be a good tool to refer to during the video. Oh, and speaking of vendors, I'll timestamp whenever I show them on the video in the pinned comment separately from the chapters, just so they're easy to access. Throughout the entirety of this project, I used the Elden Ring FuturePress Guide Volume 1 and occasionally Volume 2 to help me find differences. It was an invaluable resource when it came to exploring the areas and spotting items that were out of place. A few friends helped write these books, so special shout out to Charlie Bit Me, Gun Destiny, Half Damage, and A German Spy. They all stream, with varying frequency, if you're interested in checking them out. Tell them I sent you. During the bulk of the video, you may occasionally be able to hear differences in my voiceovers. I do apologize ahead of time if those are distracting. These videos were made over the span of a year and a half, like I said, and even in 2 different locations, so mic settings might have changed at some point. Re-recording all those would have simply added another month of work, most likely. And of course, undoubtedly there will be things I missed. This game is humongous after all, so feel free to let me know anything that you may know that I missed, and I will update the pinned comment with it once I fact check it. I did verify as many of the changes y'all already commented throughout the individual area series, so hopefully I covered most of those. Oh, and if you did comment on the previous videos, stay tuned to the end of the video. Hopefully you'll find a pleasant surprise. Alright, finally, let's get into it. In 1.0, the character creator music is different than it was after release. If it's been a minute since you heard the release version, here it is. This is an untitled track, but it is used in the actual game, in release. It is the song that plays whenever you're approaching a boss and they see you, but they're not quite aggroed yet. This is also used in 1.0, but it can be found elsewhere, in similar circumstances, as this Tree Sentinel did the Caelid theme instead. Just with different bosses. The Confessor class is called Intelligencer in 1.0. That includes the armor set as well. The Prisoner's text goes out of the text box a little bit. The Crimson Amber Medallion keepsake is called a Red Amber Medallion here, although it's named the same in the actual game. And it has a slightly different description in this flavor text. Pretty much all the items have different descriptions here actually. The Loner base template has a different description. The Reedlander has a very slightly different description. Same goes for the Nightfolk. The Newman is named Visitor in 1.0 and has a different description as well. Now to actually boot up the game, there's music that plays in this tutorial area, the Stormveil theme. Where normally it doesn't play anything at all, it's just ambience. The HUD is a little bit more basic and clean than will be later on. This actually looks identical how it looks in the network test. And this will extend to the boss health bars as well, which also looks simpler. Blocking this boss made me realize that this specific shield doesn't have 100% block in 1.0, as it did do chip damage, but pretty much everything's the same at the boss. Once we get sent to the tutorial cave, the Stormveil music plays here as well. And it also normally doesn't play anything. The damage and negation numbers are more decimal based, instead of going from negative to positive and being at 0 when there's no armor. And you basically want the numbers to be as low as possible, instead of as high as possible. The phantom at the chair that normally points at the Cave of Knowledge doesn't say anything. But here's a very interesting change. In 1.0 there's no additional cliff edge to let you know that it's safe to drop down here. You basically have to make a straight fall down to the cave itself, instead of being a little lip where you can fall safely. It was certainly a good idea because it does look like a very deadly fall, in 1.0 at least. The whole Cave of Knowledge was pretty much identical as far as I could tell. The only difference was that the Soldier of God doesn't disappear after killing him. He just ragdolls. When you warp to the Stranded Graveyard Grace, it pops up a big French folk hero's grave text, when normally it just shows Stranded Graveyard. But when going into the dungeon itself, it pops up a smaller version text too. Imps in 1.0 don't have hemorrhaging buildup, it's just physical damage they do. As you go up the elevator near the big pots to destroy the chariot, the game thinks you're in a Stranded Graveyard briefly, then corrects the title to French folk. At the highest point of the hero's grave, there's no loot with the dragon wound grease, and the Banished Knight does not drop the Dragon Communion seal, and we've yet to find it. The Grave Glovewort 1 at the bottom of the dungeon is Fulgur Bloom instead. The tree boss is a good show of how some enemies and bosses in this game will not have the yellow riposte indicator when staggered, but you can still riposte them. The Finger Severer has a different design for the icon, has more of an arrow look to it instead of being, I guess, finger looking. This is a minor detail, but the allocate flask charges prompts says distribute flask charges instead. The Tree Stand of Fight was identical, but the Golden Halberd has charge 4th as the Ash of War instead of Golden Vow. Golden Rune 1s are called Pauper's Runes in 1.0. Golden Runes 2 are known as French Folk's Runes 1. And Smithing Stone 1 is Smithing Stone Shard. Here's Caelid's Merchant Stock. It's mainly missing some consumables and the chain armor, and adds a few weapons. A vast majority of merchants will have different stocks, so I'll always make a note of them. The Nomadic Merchant's Cookbook was named Deserter's Cookbook, and the second one is labeled as 11. And the Missionary Cookbook 1 is labeled as 2 instead. These cookbook name changes are generally irrelevant. Wherever you find the cookbook should match the recipe it has, so I won't mention the name changes of these from now on, but I'll have very in-depth notes on them in the companion sheet. The Note of Wondrous Physic is named Nomad's Letter, and the description is addressed as a letter as well. It has more details and it hints at another merchant location. It was actually very interesting. The Catacomb Hint statues say Guide and Gatekeeper for those journeying back to the tree, instead of returning to the roots. Over in the Stormfoot Catacombs, there's 2 Ghost Glovewort 1s instead of the Praetling Pate Hello carving, and as far as I know, that item is missing entirely. There are no Wandering Noble Ashes, and the boss is named Burial Tree Watchdog instead of Earth Tree Burial Watchdog, but the fight and reward are the same. There's nothing different in the Groveside Cave, I just want to point out that the Crackpot is still there. I will be noting all locations of the Crackpots, even if they are the same, just so everyone can know where they're at. The Slumbering Egg are called Moon Egg in 1.0. One of the very few crafting material name changes. The Godric Soldier Gear is called Morgott Soldier Gear for some reason. Have fun with that one, Lord Hunters. You still get the Storm Stomp along with the Wet Knife, but you may notice that the design of the Ashes of War is different. All Ashes of War will have a more standardized design, so I won't be mentioning all of them. This is what they look like in the network test as well. The Lordsworn Greatsword has the more unique Greatsword moveset that weapons like the Knight's Greatsword and the Iron Greatsword have. So that you can have an early, non-farmed Greatsword with that moveset if you want. It's still in the same spot. And meanwhile, the Knight's Greatsword doesn't have that. It has the normal moveset. The map loot pickup doesn't show very prominently at first, making it harder to see. But then if you let it load in more, it will show almost as much as release. Melena's initial dialogue is the same. The only difference to discuss now is that after you level up, she has a brief additional line of dialogue.
It is done.
This is definitely interesting. This definitely implies that it wears her out in some way. One subtle detail that you won't notice unless you play 1.0 is that you don't have to let go of triangle, or whatever button you use, to sit down at graces. You just have to press it. This makes riding Torrent a little annoying if you have it in your pouch, because you have to get away from the grace to ride him, unless you started holding the button before you got off the grace. Since we have Torrent now, let's not waste any time and discuss the Pegasus glitch. If you're unaware, this is a glitch that lets you pretty much fly, I guess you can say, with Torrent. That was definitely patched at some point in the game's lifespan. And if you're wondering if you can do it in 1.0, you definitely can. Pretty much the whole process is identical as far as I can remember. The only difference is that when you call back Torrent when he dies, you only have to call him the one time, not twice. So it does save a little bit of time. But it does work the same way as well. You just run in a straight line. To gain elevation, you go on a hill or something. And you still have to be careful if you jump to not get caught infinite falling until you die. I will be talking about the major glitches that were patched out later on, so do stay tuned for that. You have to get a lot closer for Bog to call on you.
Oi! You there?
Which leads back to the fact that there's no artillery leaf to get you close to where you can be called by Bog. Which makes sense that they added it later if the range of the dialogue is not that big yet. So they likely wanted you to notice an item, pick it up, and then they decided to extend the dialogue range, so you will notice something. While Ranni shows up in the Church of Ele, you can only see the mist on Kale, making it clear that she's keeping him asleep. Ranni gives you an item called the Wraith Calling Bell, but it's still the Spirit Calling Bell, and it works the same. We'll get back to the Wraith Calling Bell a little bit later. You still get Stomp Sweep in the same place, but this is a good time to mention a lot of items have a different name in the full description than in the item title or flavor text. I won't mention all the changes like these as there's too many, but the companion sheet should have all the ones I found, if you're curious. Near the Spirit Spring, what's normally the gold pickled Foulfoot are just arrows 1.0. I'm only mentioning this since it's an early item that a lot of people like to get to increase runes early on. Here's the Beach Nomadic Merchant stock. It's missing some weapons, but it does add some other ones, and an armor set. The Land Squirt note is missing, but the Stone Digger Troll one is there, albeit named differently. Once again, the description is a little bit more detailed. I think they changed this so the tip would be more straightforward. You are paying for a tip, so maybe they felt they should be less cryptic for once. The Coastal Cave is called Dragon Path Cave at 1.0, but the Grace is called Dragon Pass Cave. There will be a handful of name changes to dungeons and such. I won't address all of them, only the ones that I find very interesting, like this one. Again, you can find them all in the companion sheet. The Demi-Human Chiefs boss doesn't cause bleed when attacking you, but it doesn't make the fight less annoying at low level. The Chiefs are asleep again if you re-fight them, and actually the second one didn't aggro at all this time. Near the Dragon Communion Church, there are serpent arrows instead of dragonfly head. Here's the initial Church of Dragon Communion stock, which I'll update a little bit later on, as it will be different. There's a Smoldering Butterfly instead of Smithing Stone 2, and there's no Somber 1 Scarab at all. The Sword Memorial here doesn't have any text on it, and unfortunately none of them in the game will. This was definitely added later in development. Some Roa fruit near the High Road Cave can be picked up for some reason. This happens on occasion in 1.0, but somewhat rarely. The High Road Cave location and Grace are both called High Road Caverns instead. Most caves with a similar name will fall onto this pattern, so I won't mention it again. The Smithing Stone 2 in this cave are just St. Trina's arrows. We'll be seeing that name a lot in Limgrave. Speaking of which, if you've noticed, they're simply called Trina's arrows instead of St. Trina's. The Shamshir isn't here in this cave, but it will actually be found later on. But to not break the flow of the video, if I find something later on, I'll simply timestamp it in the corner instead, if you're curious. The boss fight and reward is the same. The only noteworthy details at the end of the description is slightly different in the lore sense. The Somber Smithing Stone 1s are just called Somber Smithing Stone. The Smithing Stone 1 in the bridge with the Knights Cavalry is Gravity Stone Fans instead. And speaking of which, the Knights Cavalry isn't considered a boss in 1.0 version. But despite that, the whole fight is identical. It drops the same thing, it just doesn't have that boss status, with the health bar below. The Somber Stone 1 in this chair is a Trena's Lily. I got an Aristocrat Garb Altered version, but it's called Light instead of Altered. This will be common form, that's just what they're called since they're generally lighter. There's no enemy that drops the Glintstone Staff around this rune. And the Golden Rune 3 is named Fringefolk's Rune 2. So as you can see, we're following a slightly different pattern for rune name conventions. And from here on, I'll save discussing all the name changes until the very end of the video for the runes. They'll occasionally bring up runes if they replace another item. The Great Epi is just a Pauper's Rune. There's not even a chest here, so rip that weapon. You still get a larval tier from the Mimic Rune Bear, just like the pots and bottles. I'll mention these as well so people know where they are. I got an invisible enemy here, just randomly. Once I reloaded it, it did seem to fix it, but it does occasionally happen in 1.0 version. The Smithing Stone 1 near this bottomless pit is a root resin. which I might occasionally call rot resin in later occasions, so if I dub awkwardly over it later on, that's why. The lump of flesh in this beach segment with gravitas is a Trina Lily. The Twin Blade is in the same place and it's almost the same, but it gives me a chance to talk about something else. A lot of weapons will have been tweaked in later patches. So for instance, you may notice that the moveset of the Twin Blade is slower, but this is basically how the Twin Blade was on release. But if you only played it later on, you may not know Twin Blades are sped up in general. So if you're playing 1.0 and notice a few details like that, just know that they may not be 1.0 specific things, just something tweaked in later patches. The Agheel fight and drops are the same, but you don't get the Dragon Communion prompt, because that was added in later patches as well. You can actually reach Patches' cave before Nera just invades you in 1.0. But once he does, he doesn't have his full title of Bloody Finger Nera's name. It's just his name. Yura summons himself from the opposite side of the river, and from really far away. Yura doesn't have any dialogue during the invasion itself, he just stays silent, unlike in release. Nera just drinks 2 flasks instead of 1 like in release. The Reduvia has 0 arcane requirement, which makes it even more useful and busted for 1.0 playthroughs. And this is a good way to show that blood loss buildup is simply called hemorrhaging in the description. It doesn't give you a value of how much buildup it does. It only tells you that it does build up bleed. Murkwater Cave is called Caverns as mentioned before, but the more interesting difference is that the Grace is labeled Tombsworth Caverns, which should be an area in Whippy Peninsula instead. In this cave, you find a chest that is completely empty, normally has some mushrooms in it. We'll be seeing a lot more of these chests, so brace yourself. The chest that triggers Patches has glass shards inside, instead of the normal cloth garbs. Patches doesn't take cover under his shield when he yields, nor does he go directly into his Patches squad afterwards. If you get snared by Patches' chest, you can actually just warp back straight afterwards. You're not blocked from warping in 1.0. This is Patches' stock. The main note here is that he sells infinite gold pickled foul foots, so you don't need to farm foots for this in this version. He also has early infinite serpent arrows. As we've seen so far, seems to be missing some ammo and gear, but instead has different gear. Over in the Murkwater Catacombs, the root resin near the lever is gravity stone chucks instead. The Gravewarden Duelist seems the same, but I do want to point out that the buff is different. It looks a lot like the Dark Souls Remastered Red Tearstone Ring effect, except probably stacked and just spread all over his body instead. The Kaiden enemies have this as well. When defeated, this guy drops the Battle Hammer. Apparently this was what it dropped at launch, and eventually it was replaced by a Spirit Summon, the Banished Knight Engvald. And so after a certain patch, you would simply have to farm it instead. But there you go, this may be a way to get this item if you don't want to farm it, by creating a new PSN account, playing 1.0 to get this, and then updating it. Or trading it to another player to use it in current patch. One of the many uses for the 1.0 versions that we shall see today. The map Pumpkinhead boss has a guaranteed Pumpkin Helm drop. I fought this guy 4 times and it dropped 1 every time, and I was told it was the same in the network test as well. The spell Crystal Barrage is called Shard Barrage in 1.0. There's no somber one scared me the Artist's Shack. Definitely seems like they're a bit stingy with those, and were added later on in development. The Smithing Stone 1 near the Artist's Shack is a gold firefly instead. You still get the Homing Instinct painting. The reward is the same, but it's called Prayer Scarab instead of Incantation Scarab. Except it doesn't seem to have the equipment effect on reducing FP costs on incantations, so it's just the ugly helmet that it is. Kenneth Hyde's dialogue range isn't nearly as far, which thank God, you'll have to hear that as you kill enemies nearby. Hello? The Smithing Stone 2 near the Rune Bear fighting the wolves is Gravity Stone chunks. There's still a Scarab that drops a Sacred Blade, but it's called Imbue Holy in 1.0. The Crimson Crystal Tear and the Wondrous Physic are 2 separate loots, so make sure to get both if you're playing 1.0. Sacred Tears are called Flask Tears in this version, making it more clear what they're for at least. This is a good time to show this. In a later patch of the game, they added a yellow dot next to new prompts while sitting at the Grace, but of course that doesn't happen in 1.0. When Melina channels Marika's words in the churches, she doesn't look up slightly, to indicate this isn't her own quote. The Crystal Tears at the Minor Erdtree and Mistwood are also separate loots, so if there's 2 lootable items in any given spot, I would recommend double checking that you get both. The Mistwood Ruins are called Mistwood Derelict instead. Smithing Stone 2 are called Large Smithing Stone Shards in 1.0. And inside the Mistwood Ruins, we find the Dragon Crest Shield Talisman instead of the Axe Talisman. This is the Mistwood Merchant stock. The main highlight here is that you can buy infinite Shatter Shard arrows, and Fletch too, along with early infinite Bird Bolts. But I will say, beware if you kill Radahn. This merchant disappears for whatever reason if you do. Obviously it's related to Meteor Strike in Limgrave, but I couldn't find him again. so get what you need early, or kill him for his bell bearing. In Fort Hythe, this Smithing Stone 1 is string instead. Enemy ballistas and other destructible arsenal like that will show their health bar when being destroyed. Definitely very handy and wish they kept it for release. Behind the Bloody Slash Knight, there's a cracked pot here instead of the Blood Rose. Bloody Slash has a knockback on the attack, which certainly makes it a bit busted in a way. The HP drain makes more sense with this in mind. Going back to Kenneth, he doesn't have an option to join his service, he simply resumes the demi-human lines. Since he's so chatty, this is the perfect time to show that in 1.0, you can actually skip dialogue very fast. Pretty much as fast as some of the prior games, where it was slowed a lot in the post-release version. But I should note that Kenneth never actually goes back to Fort Hythe, he just disappears. I'm aware that Nepheli's quest isn't complete until a later patch, so it's possible the same with him. You still receive Finger Snap from Caelid after hearing Blythe, but your character will actually chuckle after you do it. Where it doesn't at post-release. You can still summon Blythe for Darrowell, and this is a good showcase that in 1.0, NPC summons don't generally have their appropriate names, and just say Furled Finger. Bloodhound's Fang is identical it seems, its Ash of War is just named different. Either Bloodhound's Approach or Soaring Spinning Slash, instead of Bloodhound's Finesse. Blight still gives you a Somber Stone too, but it's called Large Somber Smithing Stone. One quick note, after telling Caelid about Blythe, I checked his shop one more time, and he had one extra crackpot. Unsure if this is a bug, a 1.0 thing, or what, but given how valuable crackpots are early on, I figured I'd note it. Maybe it's replicable. The Smithing Stone 1 in this foresty cemetery area is a tarnished sunflower. Add a Sun Realm shield drop, and apparently it's called Seed of the Sun Shield. Interesting rename, that one. I didn't find the Godric Soldier Ashes in the same cemetery. The Stone Sword Key in Stormhell Shack is Trina Arrows. The Smithing Stone 1 near this chair guy is a Trina's Lily. For some reason, picking up items in the coffins and horseback is very tedious. You either have to get on top of it or get off your horse. If I had to guess, they did extend the headbox a little bit for grabbing those in post-release to make it easier to just get him on horse. Henricus is called Of the Volcano Manor instead of Recusant, but he's identical and still drops a hammer talisman. This phantom in front of what is now the Colosseum used to be here complaining that the doors are closed. Of course, his wish is now granted and he's not here as of that patch. The Somberstone 1 scarab in this ruin is a Cerulean scarab instead. The Golden Vow Knight uses a spell and it looks different. It's similar to the Dark Souls Remastered buff we mentioned earlier, but gold instead. The actual Golden Vow Ash of War is called Earthtree Vow. And interestingly, the alternate name is Oath of Sunlight, which is a weapon art from Dark Souls 3 that works similarly to Golden Vow. There will occasionally be small leftovers from previous games like this, and I'll point out the ones I notice. The Grace at the Death Touch Catacombs is named Shunned Catacombs. Interesting. There's no Uchigatana in these catacombs, and unfortunately I haven't had any report of it being found elsewhere, so it seems like it's locked to the Samurai starter class, otherwise you can't get it in the game, in 1.0 version. There's no Lance Talisman in the corner of Limgrave. Here's Bernald's initial stock. A few Ashes of War have differing secondary names, but the main difference is Endurance is called Indomitable in the main name, but still Endurance in the description. And Warcry is called Warriors' Roar. There was no Lance, and no Beast Crest Heater Shield in the little camp near Alexander. When the Deathbird appears, it has Ghost Flame surrounding it. When in release, it just kind of spawns awkwardly. The Deathbird also isn't considered a boss, just like the Knight's Cavalry. The Poker has a normal fire effect instead of Ghost Flame, or just nothing like the non-right birds have in current patch. But besides that, the fight is the same. It still drops a Feather Talisman. And finally, for the nighttime bosses, the Bell-Bearing Hunter doesn't spawn here, and none of the ones later will either, meaning they weren't added in the game yet. We may see a variant of the Bell-Bearing Hunter soon though, but if you haven't noticed, it seems that the bosses that aren't considered bosses in 1.0 are the nighttime ones. So perhaps it's either a programming bug, or they simply wanted it to be more normal mobs that appear at night at first, though they still feel like bosses regardless. The Shatter Shard arrows have a different effect when you shoot them. Here is the North Limgrave Nomadic Merchant. Clearly this one focuses more on consumables, and it's certainly nice to have infinite purchasable fire grease. The Tibia Mariner is named Bone Beckoner Mariner in 1.0, but the fight is identical and still drops the same things. The Smithy Stone 1 in the boss arena is Smoldering Butterflies. And Wall Strike's secondary name is Frenzy, which while appropriate, would definitely be confusing in lore. Now that we're done with Limgrave proper, we're going to hand the Round Table Hold now. Melina's warp to the Round Table Hold is instant, rather than waiting for your hand to rest on her or anything. When first arriving here, You may notice the Round Table Hold plays a seemingly more subdued version of Leyndell Royal Capital theme. Instead of the release version of Round Table Hold song. Catch Flame is called O Flame, and Flame Sling is called Feast Upon Flame. If you're thinking O Flame is on release version, yes, sort of. We'll discuss that when we get there. Ainsel doesn't have his normal stance, he's just standing awkwardly, but he does still give you the gesture. Here's the Twin Husk stock, and you can tell it's missing everything. Some of the starter weapons you can find elsewhere, some you can't. Varies case by case. Hyugh's menu does have a tab for upgrading already equipped equipment. You'd have to tab over to the weapons or shield segment or whatever you need to upgrade. Mad Tongue Alberic is named Frenzied Tongue instead, but everything's the same, including the gesture and reward. And last thing for now, there's no Cypher Pada in the Round Table Hold. The Krapus' Black Key Crossbow is just called Black Crossbow, and the Assassin's Prayer Book is called Shadowed Prayer Book. In 1.0, Margit is simply named the Fell instead of Margit the Fell Omen. That matches with his cutscene at the very least, but the Fell Omen is his full title and lore, so. Ironically, the Grace itself is called Margit the Fell Omen. Margit is actually using Melania's theme during his boss fight. Instead of his self-titled one in post-release. And this includes the transition to Phase 2 as well.
Thou art of passing skill. Warrior blood must truly run in thy veins. Tarnished.
Whenever he kills you, he doesn't have a dialogue when you die. The foolish ambitions to rest bit. He simply remains quiet. That's all differences I can find from Margit, but I do want to bring up the network test briefly, because a lot of these changes are actually different from the network test as well. For instance, in the network test, his name is Margit the Fell Omen already, and he does have the death dialogue implemented already. Additionally, he has a different song which is a version of Melania's theme, but not the exact same one. You can find on YouTube as an unreleased version of the Melania song, but for Margit. And I find this very interesting, because as we theorized early in the video, I believe that this 1.0 version was finalized around December, and the network test for this game came out in November. If I had to make a guess of why this works like this, it is that the network test was a different build of the game. Perhaps they just got the game from a certain point in time, for lack of a better term, let's say copied it into a different work file entirely, and then cut off anything that wasn't going to be part of network test. And then they started tweaking with that separately. And they would have to, because they would have to have online play implemented by the time network test happened. So perhaps some of the changes that they were going to make to their base game, they simply implemented in the network test as they finished work elsewhere in the normal build of the game. And then eventually, through the day one patch, they implemented some of the changes from network test that they liked to the actual game. That's just my theory, of course. I don't have anything solid to base that off of. If you have any other ideas, do leave them in the comments. Now into Stormveil Castle itself. The Smithing Stone 3 is called a Hard Smithing Stone, so just as Golden Runes, these have different naming conventions, and we'll discuss the entirety of them towards the end of the video. There's no Marred Leather Shield in 1.0, and there's also no Hook Claws either, despite there being a corpse there still, where the item would normally be. To get things backwards this time, the St. Trina's arrows here are root resin instead. However, just a little further ahead, the Smoldering Butterflies are Trina's arrows. When you're locked in the room with the Banished Knight, you don't hear Gostalk's laugh when the door closes. There's also no chest in this room with the Curved Sword Talisman. Not so fun fact, in the network test, there's a Grafted Scion here, instead of the Banished Knight. Yep. Whereas normally the Break Hammer is a Cracked Pot in 1.0 instead, the corpse normally has a Silver Pickled Foulfoot is empty. And after dying, I noticed that Gostalk doesn't actually steal runes on death in this version. Speaking of which, here's Gostalk's stock. Obviously we lose a lot of things here, but what we do get in 1.0 version is worth a loss. The Ragged Armor is a set that is not available in current patch. You can only get it in 1.0 on consoles at least. And you can alter it too. You can update the game to keep the set in current patch, but you need to know that you need to start a fresh PSN profile to play in 1.0 and then you can update. Because you can't downpatch that profile back to 1.0 once you open the game in current patch. Also, you can't drop this set, so another player can't pick it up to pass it on back to another character of yours, or whatever. I've also been told that you won't get banned for doing this, and that checks out as there's no bans on consoles really, but regardless, do so at your own risk. The Nomadics Warriors Cookbook 10, albeit named Deserters Cookbook 4, is moved to the rooftop where you fight the mass fire-breathing eagle, where you normally find the Gesture. The Gesture itself is where the Claw Talisman normally is, which as far as I know hasn't been found in 1.0 unfortunately. There's no marred wooden shield on the drop to the Crucible Knight. Here's Rogier's stock. It's identical aside from all their secondary names being different. Spinning Weapon being Whirling Swarm, Glintstone Pebble being Magic Bolts, and Carrying Greatsword being Carrying Glintstone. The Stone Sword key above the Grafted Scion is just string. The chests in this area kept closing even after I already opened them, but they don't have anything inside, predictably. It was just a bug that kept happening, I guess. There's no Highline Axe in the same room. The Iron Whetblade is still behind the Stone Sword key room, but there's no Hawk Crest wooden shield, and no Misericord either, unfortunately. I had a Commoner's headband drop, and you'll notice it's called a Subject's hood, and I believe all clothes are labeled as Subjects instead of Commoner. I also had an Exile Gauntlet drop, but it's named Banished Gauntlet. It's only Banished, not Banished Knight. Those are still named the same, but when you get to Leyndell, you may see the connection. The Godslayer seal chest isn't here at all, and is currently a missing seal. It's possible it could be farmed from an enemy like some that will be later on, but the enemies I've tried haven't dropped it yet. There's no pike in the courtyard in Stormvale. There's also no wooden great shield. The Smithy Stone 2 near the left side chamber is just rune fragments. There's no Arbalest in the exploding ballista area. The lootable commoner symbol garb near the gate side chamber is just a Smithing Stone 1 equivalent. The Smithing Stone 2 near the Exile Ballista are just strings. There's only one cracked pot near the living jars. The Smithing Stone 1 above the living jars are root resin. There's no Manor Tower Shield in the commoner's area. The Rancor Call incantation is called Spirits of Death. Before the Godwin face, the Bloodstain from Rogier is not there, like they are in the later release. In one of the rooftops where you see a lot of Exile and Banished Knights pairings, remember when I said we may see a Bellbearing hunting later on? Well, here you go. It acts pretty much identical to the Elmer and Bellbearing hunters, and this isn't here in release, so they obviously used this fight for other purposes, and constrained it as a nighttime boss. Definitely one of the wildest changes. This one drops a perfume bottle when killed. Now going on to Godric. I noticed that you can't dodge this attack by simply running or strafing around him. You actually have to time a dodge. If you die during phase 2, Godric has an additional line of dialogue after his normal line.
Great Godfrey, didst thou witness? This strength is mine.
This will be the case here and there for some of the major bosses. Besides that, the fight is identical. The only other difference is that it drops less runes, which was also the same for Margit, and likely will be the same for most major bosses at least. Heading back to the round table, you will notice that when Rodrika moved here, she's to the right of the chimney 1.0 instead of to the left. I believe this was changed so you're more likely to see her, being that she's an important NPC. As from your spawn point, most of the places you'll want to go will be to the left, so you're more likely to see her there. As she is in 1.0, it's more possible you'll miss her. Given the Godslayer prayer book, you can see that the Black Flame is called Black Flame of the Godslayer, which is definitely more descriptive. Black Flame Blade is the same, but as you can see, the description is a little bit more on the nose. Here's something I noticed that gave me a giggle. When you get Rodrika to become a Spirit Tuner, the card on her menu calls her Certified Spirit Tuner instead of just Spirit Tuner. After talking to Rogier and Fia a little more for their dialogue, we get the Black Knife clue and it shows that Fia is called Fia with a PH in some of the item descriptions. You'll notice that even though I failed Godric, the 2 fingers won't see me and Gideon is still apprehensive. And that's because it turns out we actually have to activate the Grey Rune for them to accept us. So making our way to the Divine Tower, the Lion Guardian can enter the Banished Knight statue room, so be careful there. When killed, the Lion Guardian doesn't drop anything. You may notice that the portal at the end of the bridge isn't there, but if you look down, you can see that it is there, just in the crumbled part of it. The reason it was moved above should be obvious. I'm sure many people in playtesting missed the portal, so they put it higher up. Before we take it, we can also see that there's no Ash of War scarab. After activating the Great Rune, the only difference with the two fingers in Enya is that the two fingers doesn't change position when speaking. The next interesting change is that some of the Twin Husks shop was originally held by Enya, as you can see here, albeit with less items of each. Very small detail, but Gideon doesn't look at you when talking. Rude. There's no stranded soul near the Shabriri grape, but the grape itself is still there. The Stone Sword key in the Bridge of Sacrifice is Explosive Stone in 1.0. Irina has a warning light for her Wrath of Gold style attack when you hit her, before fully turning aggro. And if she is aggro, she still has the attack itself. Irina's letter spells mourn differently and has a bit of a different description. The Smithing Stone 2 in this path is missing, but the Morning Star in this chest is replaced by the Smithing Stone 2 equivalent, so I guess it just shifted them around. Here's a Castlemorn Rampart Nomadic Merchant. We lose a few weapons and an armor set, but gain a lot of the Twin Husks' weapons here. The Chain Draped Tabard are named Mail Tabard in 1.0. The Stone Sword key at the chair on the northeast edge of Weeping Peninsula is a Blood Rose. In the Impaler's Catacombs, there's no prattling paid Please Help Me carving. The Ordis' Rise is named Ordis' Glintstone Rise instead, and this will actually be the case for every single rise that's named in this convention. So I won't mention them again, unless the rise's name itself is actually quite distinct. Not only that, but you may have noticed that the apostrophe S is changed to just apostrophe, getting rid of the double S in the previous version. Alright, who came to this Elden Ring video for a quick lesson on grammar? If you were taught in a similar school system as myself, you may have been taught that you don't put an apostrophe S after a word that already ends with an S. For example, the dog's bone is fine, the dog's plural bone is not. It's spelled like this. This is correct, there's no question there. What I learned from the discussion on these changes in 1.0, however, is that when it comes to names, there's not a set rule. In this case, both spelling of Ordises are acceptable. It is simply a matter of which style you choose to use, as long as you keep it consistent across your work. My main source is Grammarly, but I checked other sources and they do seem to concur. This means that and most of the commenters on my series' school system picked the S apostrophe style, which is valid, but so is the other form. I won't really mention these kinds of changes again, as I'm not going to rethread this topic, but you should be able to see all the ones I found in the companion sheet. Just know that it seems like they do follow a consistent style for their respective versions. S apostrophe for 1.0 and S apostrophe S for release, which you gotta give them credit for. There's no Great Turtle Shield in this tower, though you may find it somewhere else. The Yellow Ember ingredient is named Sallow Ember. The Frenzy Rats have red eyes instead of the orange-yellow that Madness usually represents, even when it's the same for other enemies. And when they attack you, you can see the design of the Madness bar is different, being purple instead. However, the effect that Madness has on you is the same. The Aileen Village is called Kalu Isolated Village instead, and that includes the Grace name and all. And the Kalu Baptismal Church is named Kalu Baptismal Font, which is actually a similar thing in context, so it's just a synonym essentially. In the Earthbore Caverns, there's an empty chest that's supposed to have pickled turtleneck, although this one leads to a trap, so perhaps it's actually partly intentional for once. The Shield of the Guilty is named Sinner's Shield. It also doesn't raise your focus when equipped, and it actually has a red particle effect whenever you use Shield Bash, instead of just normal white one I suppose. Perhaps to represent the bleed buildup it has. The Demi-Human Queen still drops her staff and spell, but Crystal Burst is named Shard Spray. Over in Morn Tunnel, the Scalimus Begone is called Scaly Aberration. There's no Demi-Human Chief at the beginning of the bridge going towards the west part of Weeping. It's just empty. Not that it was a problem to cross with horseback anyway. The Stranded Soul in front of the Church of the Pilgrim has some very subtle changes to its monologue that could have some lore implications. There's no Gilded Iron Shield next to the church. Here we find our first Erdtree avatar. Everything, including the drops, are the same. The only difference is that it's playing the dragon theme instead of its own track. It won't be the last time we see this. And no, I don't just mean with the other Erdtree avatars. As we got the upline bubble tier, you may notice that the effect on it is different in 1.0. Instead of being a bubble, it's more like the upline hard tier than anything else. But it works the same way. There's no Eclipse Crest Heater Shield. There's no thank you carving in the Tombsword Catacombs. 1.0 isn't very sociable, is it? You still get Luthel the Headless, but at the end it adds just the word ashes. Some of the unique ashes will have something like this added, but that's pretty much it. The Weeping Evergaol is named Lamenting Evergaol, which still works I suppose. You still get the Radagon Scarcia 1.0, but this is a good chance to show something. Any stat raising talismans will allow wielding of weapons as usual, but not the Ashes of War. It won't allow you to do this effectively. Given that this was changed in release, I doubt it was intentional, because it certainly makes it half redundant to use these, for stats like these at least. There's no Stranded Soul pointing to the Tower Return. I won't mention any of the other gone ones, only if the Stranded Soul is different. The Ambush Shard spell is named Salient Shard, and has a lighter blue design. The Isolated Merchant Shack is called Ascetic Merchant Shack, including the Grace. This is the Weeping Peninsula Isolated Merchant stock. The Lantern has a brighter yellow hue to it in 1.0. The node found here is named Grave Robber's Knowledge this time, and as the others it's more descriptive overall. The Tower of Return is the same, and it still takes you to the Divine Bridge. Nothing is different here, but this is a good time to showcase that you can do the wrong warp with the Stormhill Shack and stuff. I won't teach you how to do it here, there's plenty of resources that teach it better than I could. But I will say that the timing is slightly different because you can't input too fast. The game will eat your inputs if you do it too fast. But it's almost easier that way. You only have to slightly time the last bit. The Knight's Cavalry in the Weeping Peninsula still drops the Barricade Shield, but not the Night Rider Flail. The Deathbird in Weeping still drops the Sacrificial Axe, but it's called Sacrificer's Axe. The Summer 2 in the beach area next to Morn is Root Resin. Finally making it to Castle Morn itself. Castle Morn is playing the Stormveil theme. Instead of the more generic old castle theme. The Smithing Stone 2 at the beginning are ruin fragments. The chest that normally has the claymore is empty, so rip that weapon. The loot that's supposed to be the steel wire torch is a cracked pot instead, but the torch will be found later on. The Twin Blade Talisman you find in this tower is the Axe Talisman instead, so we found that after it was moved from Mistwood, but I have no knowledge of where the Twin Blade Talisman is now. There's also no regular whip weapon in here in 1.0. And finally making it to the boss, the music playing is the Grave Warden theme. Instead of Old Warriors. It actually doesn't aggro until you get close enough, which is definitely different than from post-release, where he aggroes immediately. And instead of Lionon Misbegotten, it's also called Leonine Aberration, but everything else is the same, including the weapon it drops. The Guardian Swordspear has a more standard moveset in 1.0, instead of the more unique one in current patch. There's no cracked pot on the branch near the Minor Erdtree. In the Minor Erdtree Catacombs, the Wolf Imp Head is just a golden rune. When Elden Ring released, there was a bug at the boss of the Minor Erdtree Catacombs, where the Stick of America wouldn't actually work. This was fixed shortly after with a patch, but trying it at 1.0 it shows that it was actually like this in the disc version as well. The Shack of the Rotting is named Plagued Shack in 1.0. The Whirl of Flame is called Flame Scour Them. The chest that normally has the greatsword is, you guessed it, empty. When looking at where the Great Jar will be from far away, it seems that the game just didn't want to load the Great Jar at the time. And when looking closer you can see that even that little stadium has a low poly model version of it. But I assume they did want to at least show the Great Jar from far away to catch your attention, and so they decided to increase its render distance. There's no Serpent Bow in the Abandoned Cave, along with no Venomous Fang. And at the Clean Rod duo fight, it was playing for a minute of Foe 1, I believe, as usual, but at least on my fight, it started in the middle of the track it seemed. It was very jarring, so I thought I was playing a different track altogether. There is no Cross Naginata in Gale Tunnel. The Magma Worm at the end of it is aggroed immediately instead of being asleep. It still drops in Moonveil, but I should point out that the reach of the R2 specially is much farther. Apparently Transient Moonlight can also cause bleed with the beam, not only when hitting with the katana, in 1.0 that is. The Flame of Redmane is called Red Lion's Flame. In the Fort Gale where you find this Chimera enemy, in this chest right here, there's no item again, and in this item is supposed to be the Qatar. Near the Gel Cave entrance, the Somber 4 is just Trina's Lilies. Inside here, once again, the Somber 5 chest is empty. On a similar note, the Wakizashi is missing in this area. It's normally in this little cell right here, but it's just not there. When you reach the boss, the frenzied duelist doesn't aggro immediately, but he does notice you and start walking towards you. And after it, the regalia of Eochaid is called Eochaid's Gem Sword. The Lifesteal Fist is called a Taker's Fist. This is the Caelid West merchant stock. There's a few more consumables here, and you can find the Vagabond armor here a lot earlier. It's normally in the Mountaintops merchant. The giant land squirts have the green poison color on their smoke cloud, but it still builds up rot, as it should. The meteoric ore blade is called a Falling Star Blade in 1.0. The raw emeralds have invisible smoke clouds, but the rod cloud is still there, so this is obviously a bug. The Mimic Troll in South Caelid still drops level tier. Pretty much everything's the same about Ixyx, except his special rod cloud attack lasts a lot longer. Here's the Caelid Dragon Communion stock, only having killed Akio and Ixyx, so I'll definitely update later. Although in 1.0, apparently Rotten Breath doesn't cause rot, it just does damage, which is definitely a little bit underwhelming. Here's the Caelid South Merchant, there's definitely some armor switch-ups. Poison Mothflight is named Venom Lunge in 1.0. The Deathrite Bird, which is likely the first one you encounter if you travel here at night, its wings are more yellow-orange hued. The chest in the shack that you get teleported to from Limgrave and Sele Tunnel, which yes, that trap still works, is also empty. Normally has the gravity stone stuff. In this same tunnel, this item at the back right here is supposed to be the Faithful Canvas Talisman, which might be found later on. At launch, the boss for this area used to be a full-grown Falling Star Beast, and that's the same in 1.0, even though it doesn't call it that. But it got downgraded later to a normal Falling Star Beast. So now I have to come back after Siofra. We can do this little segment now. There's no Spiked Palisade Shield. The Greyjar duelists seem pretty free. They're much easier than they are in release. The only difference with the Greyjar is they can actually have him stand up by hitting him, and he does get pushed back a little bit every time you hit him. So you can actually make him fall off the ledge and kill him. And he does kind of die because if you reload, you can see he's actually laying down as if he was dead. And the Greyjar Arsenal has a different design. It falls more in line with the lower forms of it. The Rotten Dog Spirit Ashes aren't where they're supposed to be. The prompt for Celia calls it City of Sorcery instead of Town of Sorcery. Also next to the Grace, Gowry does have enough for you to go meet him. The Staff of Loss, which is in one of these balconies, is also not there. The Double Slash is called Slashing Combo. The Night Comet, it was used to be called the Night Dart. And there's no Cerulean Tear Scarab in the Sele Rooftops. The Poisonous Mist is called Imbue Poison. The drops that Millicent has in 1.0 when she evades you is definitely pitiful. Not that she drops anything particularly useful or unique in the post-release, but she does drop a lot of runes. You don't find the Meteorite Staff in the swamp like you do in post-release, but you actually can farm it. The closest one from here is the Battle Mages behind the Church of Plague, but any Battle Mage you find in the game should drop it. So you can actually get more than one. And yes, the Gravity spell effect does stack still, even though the description didn't say so. Near there, there's no Perfumer Traveler set, along with no Perfume Bottle. The Sacred Rings of Light are just called Rings of Light. Once again, we have Commander O'Neill playing the dragon theme. Instead of the usual track Old Warriors. The only other difference is that Commander does summon 5 axe-wielding knights in Phase 2. Definitely very overkill. It's already pretty difficult with 3 in post-release. There's no Somber 4 near the Caelid Catacombs entrance. In the actual catacombs, there's no Miranda Sprout Ashes. The boss still drops the ashes, but they're called Kindred of Decay instead of Kindred of Rot, which we do see later on in the game too. I do want to briefly point out a lore bit. Apparently these are referred to Oracles of Rot, which definitely reminds me of the Bubble Oracles. From my understanding, they do seem to serve a similar purpose, but this definitely makes it a little bit more obvious. There's no Arrow Sting Talisman in this chest, it is once again empty. Making our way to Redmane Castle, there's 3 Land Guardians instead of 2, though they can still attack each other, so it's not really a problem if you just cheese them. There's no Flamberge in the corpse behind this mad pumpkin, just empty. And the only other difference I could find is that the chamber outside the Plaza Grace is named Secluded Cell. And when fighting the dual boss before Radon, the only difference I saw is that it's playing Grave Wardens instead of Erdtree Knights. The Ruins Greatsword Ash of War is much worse. It travels much more slowly. And it even might possibly have less range, but I'm not sure about that. Seems pretty close. Whenever the Radahn Festival is on, the Song of Honor is not playing, it's just playing the Stormvale Castle music, which I believe is just normal, but the Song of Honor not playing now is not normal. In this little field where all the warriors are waiting, you can't see any of the phantom NPCs like Tragoth and Leyndell, but funnily enough, one of the ones that should be a phantom, Okina, is actually visible. And just so you know, you can still do the Radahn Death Warp near the Church of Plague, so you don't need to have triggered the Radahn Festival if you're willing to glitch it. Just thought you know that. It does still work in 1.0, as it did on release. If you're aware of Radahn's AI manipulation, where you run backwards and deload him briefly, at least currently what happens, when you load him back in, he'll start running towards you, just making it a little faster to engage him. But in 1.0, if you do that, he'll just kind of break briefly, but if you get close enough, he'll resume firing at you. So it's not as useful as it is in current patch. When looking through the summons, I could not find Alexander or Patches. Patches I'm not surprised, but Alexander, I mean, he's supposed to be part of this questline very distinctly, so that was interesting. Blythe is a little more hidden, but I did find him eventually. Though funnily enough, Blythe does no damage to Radahn. I assume it's because he can't wield his weapon for some reason. Speaking of summons, apparently you can actually hit them and kill them. Not really sure how that works, but that's how it happens. Tragoth seems to get a little too excited and starts fighting in his own world before you even summon him at times. Presumably after you've summoned at least once or something. Oh, and once again, Radahn is playing Melania's music, just like Margit. Including second phase, but of course, this one's a lot more ironic given that they're actually rivals. During the phase transition, the sky changes color very abruptly, but it still dims to nighttime, like normal. The sky turns back to light just as abruptly after you touch the grace as well for some reason. And for the last little bit of Caelid, in the Warded Catacombs, the sniping Red Mage Knights don't attack you properly. They're supposed to snipe you from far away, but I have to get pretty close for at least one of them to get firing at me. And there's also no Radahn Soldier Ashes. The isolated shack here is also named Ascetic Shack. This is Dragonsbarrow isolated merchant stock. It's actually pretty close, only missing a few things. This is the first ritual pot we find, so I should point out that they're called ceremonial pots in this one. And gravel stones are called compound stones. I don't plan on showing every single note, but the Caelid Hideaway one is very interesting. It refers to a Dragon Communion cave as a main reference. At first I thought maybe the Church of Plague used to be a Dragon Communion church, but it doesn't really seem to be implying that. It's referring to what's going on right above the cave, I assume, with the dragon infested area. It's just never referred to as a communion area in game as far as I know. Before the Divine Tower, the exploding Somber 8 Scarab and Dragonsbarrow is missing. The Black Flame Monks' fire attacks are more reminiscent of Destined Death, or perhaps the regular fire monks, although some of the attacks and the effect of fire on you is still black and white. The Godskin Apostle in the Divine Tower plays Grave Warden instead of the Godskin Apostle theme. Now the interesting thing is that this is the only one that doesn't play it. The rest of the Apostles and even Nobles, I believe, play their appropriate theme. So I guess just this one that's a little bit different. When you get to the second phase of the Godskin Apostle, it also has a red-black hue around it instead of the black and white, kind of like the Black Flame Monk earlier. The Urchin refuses all. Yes. At this jail, Battle Mage Hughes is named Battle Mage Odin instead, though the ashes that it drops is still named Battle Mage Hughes. At the top of this giant skull, all the loot up here was different for some reason. It's a lot of Mythy Stones in current patch, so it's definitely kind of bad. After giving Millicent the needle and reloading, she's still laying down, but she does have her hair up and everything. She's still standing in the rest of the segments like usual. Night Maiden's Mist is called Silver Mist of Nokron. Eternal Darkness is called Salian Darkness. In Caelid Hideaway, the Somber 4 is Kuka's Glintstone instead, so that's a couple Sombers 4 we missed between Caelid and here. There's no crystal spear in the illusory wall. There's another empty chest. And the hidden chest with the crystalline ashes is also empty. Definitely making this little super secret segment very obsolete. At the boss, the Sorcerer Putrid Crystallion has normal magic particle effects instead of the pinkish ones. And its Crystal Torrent charge has a Comet Azor charge effect instead. And during this fight, you can see that sometimes nails can shoot through the fog, which is definitely very annoying. When killing Elder Dragon Greyoll, it drops just above 25,000 runes in 1.0 instead of under 75,000 in the current patch. So it definitely increased this amount a lot. In 4th Fareth, all the blue summons at the top summon at once, which initially is very scary, but it seems like stealth is more of a viable option. So it turns out better than before. Over in Dragonsbarrow Caverns, there's no Bull Gold Talisman. And at the boss, the Throwing Knife Beastmen has lightning in their knives, when they normally don't have any. The Rain of Arrows is named Gravity Rain in 1.0. There's no Somber 9 Scarab near the Bestial Sanctum. Below the Bestial Sanctum, there's no Dragon Crest Shield Talisman. And right around here is where you find the Azula Beastman Ashes, along with that one dagger, which obviously means that we won't be finding it later on in Farum Azula. The Blackblade Kindred song is also wrong. It plays the Archery Knight theme, but in the post-release they definitely get their own track, the Death's Kindred. The Bestial Sling is called the Bestial Hail. And since we got the Bestial Sling, this is a good time to talk about chain casting. Personally, I was only able to make the jumping one work. I couldn't get the more simple standing one down, but I never actually played with it before they got patched. I assume it works just as well, but you can definitely do the jumping one or alternating spells in the chain casting. Valk has a repeated line if you follow his quest line that just sounds like a different take that got left in by accident in the 1.0 version.
I am your personal seamster after all. I am your personal seamster after all.
At the bottom of the hill, where the South Liurnia merchant normally is, if you've done his questline, you'll actually find Patches instead, which does mean that they switch spots. You'll actually find the merchant where Patches is normally in current patch, which we'll get to in a bit. For now, Patches has the same stock, but some of his dialogue doesn't match his subtitles, so it's definitely a little bit scuffed.
So right, if you get caught in it on purpose, but long ago, they were endowed with a spell of transposition.
He repeats that line in its proper spot shortly after. The Adon Thief of Fire boss here doesn't use the Flame of the Fell God until phase 2, which is after he uses this one flask healing. And speaking of which, the flame is called Soul of Flame in 1.0 instead of Flame of the Fell God. The Fire Monk's Prayer Book is called Giant's Flame Prayer Book. And from it, O Flame is called O Grand Pyre. Now, as I mentioned earlier, O Flame is a spell in the game, but it's the upgraded version of the Catch Flame spell. So the names are kind of shuffled around. But O Flame itself is only used one time in 1.0 and once in current patch. Jump into the Stillwater Cave. The Sage set is not where it normally is. It's only this little lake of poison, and it's not there in 1.0. Apparently, you can farm the Mushroom Crown here from these enemies here, which is normally a set loot you can get in the world later on in the game. And it's called a Towering Mushroom Head instead of the Mushroom Crown as well. Here's the repositioned South Liurnia merchant stock. We lose quite a bit of things here, but we do get some strength weapons that were lacking in other merchants. In the Lakeside Crystal Cave, there's a chest that normally holds the Spear Talisman, but it's not there in 1.0. And a little bit further ahead, when you actually leave the dungeon to the place with the Alboneric lady, the Slumbery Wolf's Shack is now called the Wolf Slumber Shack. In Laskia Ruins, there's no ritual pot here. And if you go a little bit deeper into it, ironically enough, you can find a ritual pot where the Wraithing Calling Bell is supposed to be. We have discussed this Wraith Calling Bell being different because we did get an item that's called that already, but it's actually the Spirit Calling Bell. This one is very interesting. Instead of getting the Volcano Manor invitation, you get an entirely different item called the Red Insignia. This does have the same purpose, but obviously has a completely different design that's not used in the rest of the game in post-release. But this symbol is actually seen in a drawing room key once you actually make it to Volcano Manor. So it is sort of a house sigil kind of situation. Blackguard sells the boiled crab immediately in Liurnia. He won't change stock later. Hopefully that does mean that this is a stronger one, because you can't get the prawn outside of starter gifts. The lobster grafted scion near the shack still drops a lava tier. Now I did do Varro's questline. I didn't find anything different at all until you actually use the warp item. So I won't mention any differences until we go to the Mohgwyn Dynasty. But I do want to point out how to do this questline in offline, given that you can't do online playing 1.0. And they didn't introduce the offline summon part of the questline until a later patch. So really all you have to do is interact with questline red summon signs, like the Volcano Manor, Yura stuff or whatever. But if you want to do it right now, you can just find one red summon sign, say Yura's for instance, and just throw yourself off the ledge a couple times. That will actually count as an invasion. So you can just redo that 3-5 times, however long it needs to do it, to trigger Varro's flag for progression. In the temple quarters, the Ice Rend hatchet is not where it normally is. The chest isn't even present where it normally is. The top Sperry Ash of War can be found on the little island next to Smaragd early, instead of the Somberstone normally in post-release. But the Scarab did still show at Top's previous location, as it normally would in current patch, even though it doesn't drop anything. So I guess it's kind of a backup in case you mess up Top's thing for some reason. When encountering the dragon that's guarding the key to Rai Lucaria, The dragon is already awake. It's not asleep as normally is, and it's just roaming around in a cycle. While fighting, I did notice that this little flame effect is different, but not by much. It's just, some changes in particle effects. The spell you get matches this color too, and they actually match the colors for each version respectively. It's kind of interesting. Terra Magical is called Guidance of the Academy. These balloons you can shoot down that normally drop golden runes just drop glintstone fireflies. Every single one I pop seemed to just drop this. Enchained Death Rancor is called Ancient Spirits of Death. There are no land scored ashes in here. In the Raya Lucaria tunnel, there's no crystal knife. The chest is empty. In the Purified Ruins, where you normally find a 2-finger heirloom, you will instead find the Faithful Canvas Talisman. I didn't find the Lucerne here in 1.0. In Cliff Bottom Catacombs, the place where the scythe is supposed to be doesn't have a scythe, has a random rune. The Wonderful Carving is also missing from here, and so are the Page Ashes, and this altar right here. When defeating the Catacomb boss, the Caden Sellsword Ashes are named Caden Mercenary Ashes. Close enough. In 1.0, at the Highway Tower Camp, the cookbook is at the top where the Karen Glennblade would be in release, instead of just a floor below, so they just completely moved that chest down. But the Karen Glennblade staff is just straight up not there. Bestial Vitality is called Bestial Vigor. Jarberg is absolutely empty. There's no flowers here that you can respawn easily to farm. The enemies are semi-aggroed, and by that I mean some of them are doing their cute stuff and then they stop, but they don't attack. And you can lock onto them as well for some reason. And there are 0 pots here, so this place is kinda useless. And if you're wondering about Jarburn, he wasn't added until a later patch, so he isn't in a game in 1.0 period. Magic Downpour is called Rain of Shards. In this little nook, there's no Mask of Confidence, the one that looks like Selvis' mask, but without the hat. But apparently you can simply alter Selvis' masks to get this instead. In the bridge going to the Divine Tower, normally you get ambushed by Godskin Noble on the bridge, and when you kill it, it drops the Godskin Noble set. But in 1.0 it seems like it's just not there at all. I even went backwards to see if that spawned it, and even after getting the loot from the tower, I went back again to see if maybe it has a different trigger, but no, just doesn't seem to be there. So who knows where the Godskin Noble set is. Now the Curse Mark and Heirloom are still there like normal. Lightning Spear is called Bolt Lance. The Briar of Sin spell does the Fire Sigil before casting, which maybe sort of makes sense given that they're affiliated, the Fire Monks and these guys. And the same thing with the Briar spell later on. And I should also note that it takes up a lot more of your HP to cast in 1.0. The Magic Glennblade is called Wolf's Sword Trap. Blessing Boon is called Beseech Aid. Some of the old archers will sometimes just go passive and not switch to their axe weapon, particularly the bow ones, but I've seen someone consistent. There's no Stalwart Horn Charm, which is going to be a trend with the Horn Charms in general. Beast's Roar is called Screeching Cry. After going through Fia and Roger's little quest lines at the round table, the only difference I noticed is that Roger has an extra line of dialogue here at the end of this, after telling you to join Ronnie.
Don't fret. It is entirely in accordance with the guidance of grace. If you seek to stand before the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord, the answers you find will surely bolster your chances.
And also, in the dialogue prompts here, for some reason you get the Ronnie Casa for Curse Mark way earlier than you should, but it leads to complete different dialogue. Roger did die afterwards, and the only difference is that the Spellblade set is just called Sorcerer set. Jumping over to the village of the Albinarics, the larval tier that's in this area is not there. And neither is the Ivory Sickle. And in a slightly different area, the Crystal Sword is not there either. Albus is hiding in a different structure here. Normally hides in a little pot thingy, but in this one he hides in a statue. And there doesn't seem to be as much light surrounding it to make it a little more obvious that there's someone hiding here. The Omen Killer boss is called just Forsaken. Just Forsaken, that's all it's called. And it is also playing the dragon song. My god. When coming back with one of the half talismans for Haligtree, Ensha still invades you, but guess what song it's playing? It's playing the dragon song again. I swear the game's just taunting me at this point, but normally it's supposed to play the Formidable Foe 2. That's the name of the track. Which is actually the same song that's playing for the Omen Killer normally, when it's not switched from the dragon song. Ensha also doesn't drop its armor in its normal location after you kill him. The converted tower is actually named the Proselytes Tower, and that word is supposed to mean a person who has converted from one opinion, religion, or party to another. And it made me realize that it's probably simply a matter of the translation from Japanese to English. Perhaps they noticed that this word, even though it's accurate, is just a little weird and complicated. So this switched to something similar in context. The sword dance is called the high slash combo. There's no watchdog staff and roads and catacombs. This chest right here is empty, and it normally has the Raya Lucaria soldier ashes. And also, this particular chest is actually one of the Dark Souls chests. It uses the same model. Now, it's not the only one. The one that has the collapsing stars and Caelid, for instance, is also Dark Souls chest, and it's still that. But at least this one was changed to the Elden Ring chest instead, in a certain patch. The Stormhawk Dean is simply called Stormhawk Ashes. Dean being, I think it's supposed to be given name of this animal. The ornamental straight swords don't have the cool attack once you've buffed the weapon and do an R2. It simply has the buff and the normal attacks after with a little more damage, I assume. So as I'm sure most of you know, around these red aggro jellyfish, you would find a jellyfish shield normally, but unfortunately it's not here in 1.0. In Kingsrow Ruins, there's a crackpot here instead of the rimmed crystal bud. The Royal Revenant boss you find under it is called Royal Spectre instead of Revenant. Howl of Shabriri is called Frenzied Roar. The Troll Knight Sword is called the Giant's Enchanted Sword. And as you can see, it has a slightly different design. Another tower here that was changed, the converted French tower is called the Proselyte's Spire. The Cannon of Hyama is called the Glintstone Shot, and the Gavel of Hyama is called the Glintstone Gavel. Frenzied Burst is called Frenzied Dart. For the Vike Invasion, his attacks don't cause frenzy. His spear hitting you doesn't cause frenzy, even the weapon art attack doesn't have frenzy buildup. But if you can see some of the other stuff, it seems to be essentially the boss fight later on in the game with the red lightning spells. So that's what it's using all around. It's even using the Vike's lightning buff on the weapon, which is cheating because you're not supposed to be able to buff this weapon, just like in the boss fight. Although in that one you even changed the Ashes of War, just nuts. But anyway, the Finger Maiden that he's defending does have the Finger Maiden set here at all. This chest right here normally has the Great Mace, but it is not here, so another chest is just empty. Here's the Ravine Merchant stock. Barbaric Roar is called Brave War Cry. In the Ruinstrewn Precipice, there's a cracked pot at this altar instead of just a rune arc. The little exploding bug that's somebody here that drops a Somber Stone is just not there, period. They really spent that dragon song as a filler, didn't they? It seems like, Jesus. And also, they call this boss Magma Worm Macal, not Makar. Near the Carrier Manor, you can get the Hoarfrost Stomp, but it's called the Hoarfrost Step in this one, so close enough, I suppose. And I did test it out a little bit since the Ice Rain Hatchet being gone is a big change, as it was a speeder weapon early on. So I did check it to see if it was just as strong, and it seems like, yeah, it's pretty strong in the Stomp Ash of War. And not just the weapon as well. It seems viable and stuff as well. In the actual Carrier Manor, the Arumi doesn't exist. The Sword of Night and Flame does exist, but I did notice that the requirements for it is much, much lower than they are in post-release. Which, given how strong it was on release at least, I guess it makes sense. There's no cracked pot here in Carrier Manor. Right before Loretta, there's some sorcerers here in 1.0 version, behind the page enemies. Getting to the boss itself, instead of being named Royal Knight Loretta, it's called Guard Loretta, and it is playing the Grave Warden song instead of the Earthtree Knight song. Also notice that she didn't use the bow spell, or at least I tried to bait it out of her, she just didn't seem to do it, so that was definitely strange. The Royal Mooncrazing Grounds Grace is called Royal Observatorium in 1.0. Here's what Piteous Stalk looks like. The most noteworthy bit is that it has Golem's magic arrows, which you normally have to farm and release. The Chilling Mist spell you get from this scarab is called Imbue Frost, and it's actually found in a different location as well, slightly. It's a little bit more close to Rena's Rice instead of Rani's Rice. There's no Albinaric Ashes. The Juvenile Scholar set is called the Neophytes set, and the Larval tier is still there. I did notice that the Onyx Lord is called Alabaster's Lord in this one, which you have a Greatsword instead. In Sylva's Rise, you can't find the Blade's Mask. It's just not there. Sylva's Potion is called Sylva's Draught. As you may know, when you give the potion to Nepheli, she'll have a drinking animation for it. But in 1.0, she doesn't do any of it. She just stays in her same pose. And afterwards, for whatever reason, Sylva's has the dialogue as if he didn't give the tonic to her. Just a bug, I assume. And also, when he's scheming, he will lean over to you to whisper like in release version. The Amber Starlight is called Starlight Amber. Pretty much everything goes the same from here. She still kills Sylva's, and you if you bother her. But funny enough, if you go back to her, she's still there. It doesn't disappear. The Preceptor set is called Professor's set also. And by the way, if you use the Celestia Do, it does make Ronnie's gang forgive you in 1.0, which I believe is the same in current patch. But yes, we're still going to discuss her questline going forward. When I did Raya Lucaria the first time, there was a reddish mist at the north entrance to it. This time the mist was blue like normal, so I guess it's just an inconsistent glitch. There's no blue-white windshield going into Raya Lucaria. In the Raven Mound invasion, Euro walks towards you before he engages the assassin, who's just waiting, instead of them already fighting. It seems that he has the quick step instead of Raptors of the Mist. Speaking of which, Raptors of the Mist is named Raptorial Revenge and shed skin in the description. This is the Raya Lucaria merchant, which is where the turtle shield is, so it's not gone from this version entirely. Fun fact, maybe, if you kill this merchant and submit the bell bearing, you'll simply get a dupe of the Ravine merchant stock. I have been killing all of them, this is the only one that's different, so I guess don't kill him, except for the one I mentioned earlier. There's a ceremonial pod behind the altar in the first room of Raya Lucaria, instead of Somberstone. The Marionette Soldier Ashes aren't where they're supposed to be, they just don't exist, and neither do the enemies that are surrounding it. And similar with the Avian Ashes, they're not where they're supposed to be in Raya Lucaria itself. Similarly, the Karen Knight set is not there at all either. The Spectral Lance is in a totally different spot than it normally is. I almost thought it wasn't there, but I had to find it in a different spot. And similarly, the Olivinus Glintstone Crown is not where it's supposed to be, but it is in a spot later on. We'll get to that soon. The Glintstone Comet Shard is called Glintstone Dart in 1.0, which is worth noting that that's the name of one of the Ashes of War in release, like the Glintstone Chris for instance. There's no ritual pod in the schoolroom classroom area, it's just a Somber 3 equivalent. Now this round of items is definitely interesting. The spare Glintstone key that you find that can give to Tops is where the comet normally is. But then if you continue just a little bit further, you find the comet where the Graves School Talisman normally is. So there's just a couple of items flip going on right here. And it's not even the end of it. There's still a little bit more to this. The Red Wolf of Radagon does have different music as well, which is sad because the Red Wolf Radagon song is really good. It's playing for Middle Foe too. The spells that the Red Wolf does look like Glintstone instead of the Karian spell look, but everything else looks the same. The Stone Sword key in the Debate Parlor Courtyard is Trina's arrows in 1.0. There's living jar shards instead of this correct pot. The Twin Sage Glintstone crown is moved to this crab in the main area. The Full Moon crossbow is not where it's supposed to be here in this tower, but this is where you find the Glintstone crown I mentioned earlier that it was in a different spot, the Olivinus one. As you'd expect, the crab you get the Twin Sage from is where you get the Carollos instead, so the two are flipped. And now to finish some of the switching items from earlier, the Graven School Talisman is here instead of where the Assure Glintstone staff is, behind that one page enemy that's really strong with the 3 bolt attacks at the same time. The Karen Knight you fight here still drops its Knight Shield, but it already has Karen Retaliation. Now for Renala, the fighting stuff seem pretty much identical. The only thing I noticed that's different is that there's very subtle changes to the dialogue and subtitles for the cutscene.
Hush, fair maid. Hush, little Culver. Ah, my beloved.
So it seems like one of them's an error and one of them just changes dialogue, but you know, close enough, I suppose. And when you're about to get rebirthed from Renala, on the little box prompt, it says to give an Amber Shard instead of a Larval Tear, but it still works via Larva Tear. I did try it and see if it cost me a thing, and it worked, and it let me in the menu. So it seems like it's just a mislabeling of the thing. These little claymen in this part of the cave are pretty passive, even after we attack them. I didn't find any of the other ones doing that, but yeah, I just found this a little bit weird. The Oracle Bubbles spell is called Magic Bubbles. This scarab right here has no drops whatsoever after killing it. I just killed it, nothing happened. And I believe it is supposed to be replaced by this Crimson one. It's just supposed to give you a heal. The Inverted Hog Heater Shield is missing, and so is the Horn Bow. But it turns out you can farm it from the Ancestral Followers. Here's the stock for the Siofra River Merchant. The Formic Rock are called a Rusty Volcanic Stone in this version. And something wild that I noticed is that there's a whole grace missing. This is the first time a whole grace has been missing in 1.0. For the Answers of Spirit boss, the only thing I noticed is that the sound design is a little bit lacking For instance, when it jumps in the air, it doesn't have the sound effect like when Torrent is doing the double jump. Now moving up to the higher part of this river where the Dragonkin is. The great oracular bubble scarab is missing, but it might be somewhere else. In the spot where you're supposed to find the America's Scar Seal, you instead get the Haligtree Talisman +1, but we also find that one somewhere else. There wasn't any different from the Dragonkin fight itself, but I did notice that the Dragon Halberd that it drops is named the Drake Halberd instead, and that the Ash of War is not the normal buff it has, the Ice Lightning one. It's just Charge Forth with no extra effect on it, so definitely a lot more lame. Also, behind the Dragonkin was just a random torch, just completely out of place. It's not here in the post-release, obviously, but it was just in here. I was very dumbfounded to see this here, and I had no idea what it served at the time, but we will get back to that later. I did go back to the 4 belfries and go to Nokron's. The model necklace is still there, so there's nothing to comment on that. I was able to get this Crystal One Knight to fall off to its death. But funny thing is that I noticed it didn't die actually. As it fell down, I waited for a while and it did not fall. Although apparently it doesn't drop any item. I could have sworn it did, but I guess not, even in current patch. Now I'm making our way to Nokron Eternal City now. The 4th height west warp seemed bug at first to me. It actually put me a little bit more to the left than it's supposed to put you normally. I did test this and see if it's related to the Nokron opening, and it is, it seems like. Before this, it just warps you to the normal place it's supposed to. So it feels like this is the game trying to lead you into the crater if you just happen to warp here. But I also eventually got attacked by wolves, so it does feel like a little bit of an oversight that they just put you in front of enemy lines. And definitely not necessary later on whenever they just marked it in your map with some of the later patches. The Ghost Flame Torch is just entirely replaced. I noticed pretty early that the Night Maiden enemies replaced some of the Fallen Hawk, is supposedly what they're called, the skinny white enemies that are around this place. And there's also a lot more silver tiers around here. There's very few in the post-release, but Night Maidens and silver tiers seem to replace the Fallen Hawk enemies. This Somber Stone is in a slightly different location than normal, but it's still there. There is an ambush right before you're supposed to be able to find the Great Shield Soldier Ashes. So you can tell that this was definitely like properly planned out as a level design thing, and then just eventually changed by a bunch of Fallen Hawks, which maybe I just want to differentiate the airs a little bit more, because you see a lot of silver tiers and Night Maidens in Ainsel. And speaking of which, the Great Shield Soldier Ashes is not here. There is no larval tier in this room right here, but there is still an ambush where silver tiers drop from the ceiling in this kind of room. There's no larval tiers here either, but I did get ambushed by silver tiers dropping down on me either way. Now this isn't the 1.0 thing, this is actually in the post-release. For the Mimic tier, it has different music, the Grave Warden song, and it's playing a lot earlier than it normally does. It normally plays the music of the boss whenever the boss is ready to fight you, but this one is as soon as you cross the fog gate, so that's interesting. The normal song it plays is called the Immured. I never use a flask in 1.0, it is supposed to use at least one. And I noticed that it had the male voice when I killed it, when my character is female. And it still drops the larval tiers. There's no Somber Scarab in this bridge after the Mimic tier. Going into the Night's Sacred Ground, there wasn't much different here, but I did see that the Nox Flowing Hammer isn't there, which that means that this small little branching path just leads to nothing, really. And you may have noticed that the torches have just the orange fire, when normally in current patch, these have a purple hue, which will be reoccurring in the rest of the area as well. The Mimic tier seems the same, but whenever you have a health increasing talisman, like the Sword Seals for instance, when you summon the Mimic tier, it'll actually have cut health, so I guess this doesn't include that additional health you get yourself. And this giant silver tier doesn't drop a larval tier as well, so it seems like just in general, there's a lot less larval tiers in 1.0. Now exploring the Ancestral Woods proper, there is no Clarifying Horn +1. The normal one was near the well in the lower part of this area, but the +1 version is not here, and I couldn't find it anywhere else either. The singing Ancestral Followers singing is a lot funnier. It's definitely very jarring hearing this whenever the previous song was actually quite nice. But here's how it sounds like if you haven't heard it in a while. Yeah, I don't know, this one got a kick out of me for sure. The Shining Horn Headband is a set item here that you can just pick up. It's not a drop from enemies. The Model Necklace +1 is also not there. So far, I lit 4 torches in this Ancestral Woods area for the boss. But when going back to the Hollow Grounds, you can see that 5 of these are lit. And also notice that one of the torches is just missing entirely. But if I light this 5th one I found up here. So yeah, if you haven't guessed so far, the 6th torch that was supposed to be for the path to the Regal Ancestor Spirit is just in a different spot. It's where the Dragonkin is, so you would have to kind of take a detour to find it. Mind you, you can make it down there easily if you know where to go. So it's not even that bad necessarily. But admittedly, I'm a little torn. I feel like it's kind of cool in a sense of exploration that you kind of have to go out of your way to find this 6th one. But for replay value, I feel like this will definitely drag on a lot. Like, you know, you're already here. You probably already just want to get to the fight. And you just have to go out of your way to this lower area instead of going to like in a kind of U formation to get them all. Now for the actual Regal Ancestor Spirit, I did notice that the music that plays when you're not in the room yet, just in the Foggate room, the Limgrave music is playing, which is definitely interesting. When I came here second time though, it was playing the normal song. So I guess it was just a bug. And of course, this boss is near identical to the lesser one you fight earlier, so it has the same differences. But one thing I noticed that's exclusive to this fight is that the animals that it spawns, some of them are a lot shinier, and they also disappear kind of left and right. Just in general, it seems like there's a lot more of them. Not that it changed anything that I can notice, it's just interesting. The Order Healing incantation is called Quell Death. The Crucible Knight with a spear doesn't drop a Somber Stone when you kill him, it just doesn't drop anything. The Missionary's Cookbook is moved from its normal spot next to D 1.0. The Valiant Gargoyle is playing a different song, the Grave Warden, which we did discuss before since we have fought a Gargoyle already. And finally, when I killed this Valiant Gargoyles, they only dropped a Vacuum Slice instead of the weapons these two are wielding. Or one of the ones that they're wielding. When you get into the ruin segment of the Ainsel River, you'll get a pop-up and it normally says Ul Palace Ruins, but in 1.0 it says Ul Dynasty Remains. This Queen Ant didn't drop anything whenever I killed it. They usually drop a Ruin Arc and a Golden Rune. Clearing out enemies around here, I caught a Descent prompt while walking around, and I tried it and it actually put me in some kind of invisible ladder that, I wasn't expecting at all. Now, I did try to do this again later, but it didn't seem to be there anymore. I think I reloaded at that point. So it's possible this was just like a corpse interaction with the geometry or something, because there was an enemy pretty much on top of the prompt. When going through here again, I got the same glitch, but going downwards this time, make me get stuck. But if anything, it confirms that it's replicable to some degree. This is the Ainsel River Merchant stock. Right here, there's no immunizing horn charm, which is a little unfortunate because we're going to need that soonish. At first I thought this was due to the little area we are, but the Basilisk Death Cloud is a different color. It has more of a purplish hue as opposed to the black with yellow particle effects on it. It still builds up Deathlight like normal. It's nothing different there. It's just that the color of the cloud is different. The Dragonkin Soldier of Naxtella is playing Grave Warden, the song, instead of Dragon, which is really weird because the last Dragonkin we fought, and one to fight later on, does play Dragon still. When killing it, it still drops the Frozen Lightning Spear, but it's called Freezing Lightning in 1.0. And just so you know, the Great Ghost Glovort is still there in the chest back behind him. The chest with the Snow Witch set wasn't there at all. I did briefly check around Rena's Rise to make sure it wasn't there. And I was maybe hoping that you'll find it later on through her quest line, but I haven't seen it anywhere. And the miniature Rani's description actually tells you exactly what to do to talk to her, which I imagine some people did miss. There's a disappearing scarab in the other side of the entrance that adds the Great Ocular Bubble instead of being in Siofra River. I missed it the first time, so I'm glad I did find it eventually. And it's also named the Great Magic Bubble instead. Around this corner, there is no Claimant Ashes. It's normally pretty hidden, but it wasn't there at all, period. The random T-posing enemy is not here overlooking the bottom of the Ainsel River area. Not that it drops anything or is that important, it's just something that I remember in my first playthrough and such. There is no Ant's Skullplate Shield. Behind this nook, there's no Archer Ashes either. There's also no Ghost Glovord 9 in this area right here. I normally wouldn't note this, but I do think the higher level upgrade material is probably noteworthy. But I will say that there is one a little bit later into Naxtella that you can still get, so worry not if you tend to frequent this one. From this really memorable ambush of the giant silver tears, you get no lava tear. And in this room nearby, you also get no lava tear from the giant one, and there's no Great Ghost Glovort in this room. In the normal release of the game, there's normally a lone ancestor follower wandering around in the swamp, but the enemy is not here in 1.0. Now, if you already know about the contents that we're going to discuss about later, that might not surprise you that much, but this enemy actually drops an immunizing horn charm +1, so it feels like a very conscious choice to put this enemy here in post-release to give you an item that would actually be pretty useful in this area. Because I'm pretty sure all the horn charms are in areas where you find ancestor followers in general. But as you can expect, there's no immunizing horn charm +1 since the enemy isn't here and I couldn't find anywhere else. The Dragonkin here still drops the Dragon Scale Blade, and it's still named the same, but the weapon art is not named the same. It's called a Hellstorm Sword instead of Ice Lightning Sword, and it still looks the same as well. Definitely looks like it still just buffs it with frost. That's a little bit lightning infused. There is no mushroom crown in this little ruin area. Nearby in this area, there is no Somberstone 8 right here, like there is on post-release. Where you normally find the Nomadic Merchant Cookbook that has some of the Rot Inflicting items, you'll instead find a Somberstone, the +8 equivalent to it. So I suppose they moved the other one from the area to here, but at the cost of a cookbook. And unfortunately, this is the only cookbook I've yet to find so far. If you happen to find it, do let me know in the comments. Do you know the hell that has the ladder that takes you up to the ascended platform? There's no scarab, and normally it has a Somber Stone 6. And before reaching the Grand Cloister, there's normally a Preserving Boluses, and normally it's not an item I'll comment on, but it's the only one you find in this area, I believe. And it's really nice to have it right before you have to go down to the Grace to heal yourself in case you're really close to dying, which you may be. So in this area, instead of having Kindred of Rot enemies patrolling around and worshipping the Scorpion Stinger or whatever, you have a bunch of Ancestor Follower enemies, but a variation of them that are cut from the base game in post-release. And you can tell this from all the rot marks all around their body. For these enemies, they seem to share pretty much the same moveset, and that includes even this attack right here, but it seemed like the enemy bugged out and just kept doing it, so I just sat down eventually. But they do have one additional attack, a Rot Breath of some sort, which predictably gives you Scarlet Rot when it attacks you. The animation it gives gave me the impression that it actually stun locks you, so I tried it again later on and it actually does. You can't roll out of it once you get hit by it. Which is maybe a little cheap, but the attack itself is not super hard to see coming and roll away from it. But here we have another variant of an enemy, this time the Shaman enemies. Firstly, you can hear the singing that it does, which is identical to the Siofra River, as we discussed before. The really funny one, not the one in the post-release. This one also has a lot of rot markings and such to be able to tell a different enemy. And secondly, the moveset is entirely the same, but all their melee attacks when they connect will cause some Scarlet Rot buildup. So in reality, there are two enemies that are cut from the post-release version of the game that we can find here in 1.0. The Scorpion Stinger has the quick step Escher War instead of the repeating thrust. And also when I opened it up, it says that it causes poison buildup, but after actually testing it, it doesn't seem to cause either poison or Scarlet Rot, which is definitely disappointing. That's, one of the unique aspects of this weapon, and one of the few that give Scarlet Rot buildup. The Putrid's Tree Spirit that is normally an ambush and release actually is just outside in the map already, but it still drops the golden seed and stuff. As soon as I enter the fight, I notice that the name of the boss is Misbegotten of the Void instead of Natural Born of the Void. It immediately started casting the Meteor attack, and the meteors themselves are more of a red-orange instead of purple like they normally are in post-release. This is all whenever it's supposed to open with the laser attack. It seems you can also open with teleporting, which is unusual as well. And it's playing the Urge Tree Knights song instead of its own proper soundtrack, so I assume it wasn't ready, or it wasn't picked out to be specifically his boss yet. After doing the fight proper for a little while, I noticed that it has an attack that has it sort of teleporting in place, but not to do that one grab attack, it's simply to do like a melee attack. It's really strange, and it almost seems really buggy. Definitely cut this later, because I haven't seen this ever, but yeah, it's very strange. The particle effects on some of the attacks is a little bit different, some of the magic attacks, but not by much. It's just something that I thought was a little bit different. And one of the most obnoxious changes I noticed during the fight, that I couldn't even figure out what was happening at first, is that I noticed that sometimes my jumps were nerfed in terms of the distance I could travel. Like sometimes I wanted to do a jump attack, but I couldn't travel as far. And I eventually noticed it's because of the water. The water actually gives you like the heavy roll running animation, even though I'm not actually fat rolling. And it doesn't give you the fat roll either. It's just whenever you run and then when you jump, it gives you the cut jump distance, like if you're just jumping in place or something. I definitely hated that, and like I said, it took me a bit to figure out what was going on, but that's something that happens in this arena, and definitely not in post-release. Now, when I actually killed it, it gave me the Remembrance of the Misbegotten, which I should remind you, the Misbegottens are called aberrations in 1.0, so I guess in a sense this doesn't conflict with other enemies. All that said though, the trophy name was actually accurate. It's still the Natural Born of the Void, which I get the impression that trophies are more based on stuff that's closer to release, like maybe they were planned out later, and could even explain why some are buggy, like the armaments one, those kind of infamously bugged and such. The name of the grace itself is also called Misbegotten of the Void. And when I checked the things you get from the Remembrance, I noticed that Waves of Darkness is called Storms of Darkness in 1.0. And also that the Bastard Star seems the same. I don't have the stats to wield it. But the Ash of War is called Starcloud instead of Nebula. And I did notice as well that it seemed to be faith-based instead of intelligence, which is very strange, that's for sure. And if you don't have the ring yet, the text that shows up once you read it is slightly different. On the world map for this area, I noticed that there's a lot of differences in the overall drawing. The 1.0 map is lacking a lot of the ruin indicators, which would just give a lot less feedback on where you could explore and such. And this little fishtail looking formation is also removed. As cute as it is, from as high up as you are and with the fog effect, you can't really tell the fish formation is even there, so I guess it's fine to remove it either way. There will be a lot of little differences like that all across the map. There's probably even some that I didn't mention from the previous areas. But this is about the most noteworthy one, so it's the one I wanted to mention. I would like to be able to do a sort of interactive map so you can see differences in real time. I guess sort of like going to Photoshop and just playing with the opacity to compare them. If I can figure out a way to do that, hopefully it'll be linked in the iCard now. But I probably won't be talking about any more differences unless it's quite unique. The Azula dragon fight seemed the same more or less, so I couldn't tell of any difference. And all the smaller dragons are still roaming around in this area. There's still starlight shards scattered all over the place in the Cathedral of Manicelis. So that's a consumable you'll need a lot of. There's still a ton here. Now going down to essentially finish Ranni's questline, I noticed that after the cutscene, her spawn is a lot buggier and faster in 1.0, and also doesn't have the same sound effect of her appearing like in post-release. So just small little polishes. The cutscene and dialogue were all the same, so nothing to comment on there. Now looking at the Dark Moon Greatsword that it drops, still named the same, but the Ash of War that it has is named differently. In the inventory menu, it's called the Moonlight Wave, but when you actually bring it out to the HUD, it's called Sword of Moonlight, which both are incorrect. It's supposed to be called Moonlight Greatsword, which definitely sounds like a very conscious throwback to the previous names in the previous games. Now, face value looks like the sword is the same as well, but once I buffed it the first time, I noticed that there wasn't the icy particle effects, and even in the buff state, it seems like it doesn't have those effects either. And sure enough, once I checked the description, it doesn't seem to have any passive frost buildup. And trying it, yeah, it doesn't seem to have frost buildup in this weapon in 1.0. The beam is still the same, but as you can tell, even the frost effect isn't there either, so. And small detail, but once you buff it, you get a small holy damage addition to your weapon as well. Now that we finished Ranni's quest, we can go back to her subjects. The Blythe encounter seems identical, except that he's just standing up in his idle spot instead of crouching. When checking his loot, I did notice that his greatsword has Freezing Surge as the weapon art in the menu, but once I actually go to the HUD again, it's Wolf Assault instead, which is the correct one in post-release. So, going to check out EG next. After talking to him and reloading the area, he was still dead, but he didn't have the black flames surrounding him. And when I looted him, firstly, he doesn't have the mirror helm that he normally drops here, but he also dropped an item I haven't seen yet, EG's Confession. Now, when I went to check this out in current patch, he did not drop it. But what I found weird is that there are logs of this item in like the wiki, for instance, and some other websites. And they all claim it's just a regular loot, and there wasn't any comment on it being 1.0 exclusive or anything. But I've never seen this before. So could this be an item that was maybe cut out later on? Once I actually read the description, it refers to EG as a she, which is definitely curious, and made me go back and check the dialogue for Blythe, for instance. And he does refer to EG as a he at one point. So I assume what happened is just one of those things where in the Japanese version, the term they use is gender neutral, but when translating it, they seem pretty sad to use she. Or at least in 1.0, because apparently some websites claim it did say he and such, but. The Ringleader's Everjo is called Bladespan Everjo in 1.0, the one that holds Electo. In this version, and I think older patches as well, you can actually bait Electo to fall off pretty easily. So if you need some good amount of runes pretty easily, here we go. And when killing her, she still drops the Black Knife Ashes, but the spelling is very slightly different of the name. Before the Landsacks ambush, you can normally find the ruler set here, but it's not there. And once actually ambushed by Landsacks, you can notice that her name is actually a bit different. It is Landsacks Ancient Dragon Progeny instead of Ancient Dragon Landsacks. And another curious detail is that it's actually playing Fortisax's song instead of Landsacks' song. There's actually not a lot different besides those two things. The particle effects on the attacks like the lightning and the fire are obviously a little bit unpolished, as a lot of things have been in this game so far in 1.0 version. But it still disappears after a certain amount of HP is taken off of them. And there's actually no difference in the later encounter either, so I won't be discussing it further. The Sacred Order Ash of War is called Imbue Holy as well, as we already had another Ash of War called that, being the Sacred Blade equivalent. When I killed the Omen Killer enemy here, it didn't drop its set. It normally doesn't drop the mask, but it didn't drop anything at all in this one. But it turns out you can just farm this set from any Omen Killer. I had a drop later on in Mount Gelmir. And predictably it's called Forsaken Rogue, just like the boss name. And when looking around, I found no perfume bottles at all. There's normally 2 in this area, but I found none of them. The talisman was still here though. Nearby in the unsightly catacombs, I couldn't find the Winged Misbegotten ashes. I also didn't find the Prattling Pate's Apologies carving. And when making it to the boss, the perfumer is named Perfumer Eulalia instead of Patricia. And as we discussed before, the Misbegotten is called Leonine Aberration, although it's supposed to be called Misbegotten Warrior, so it's vastly different in this case. Now moving to the Sage's Caverns, there is no Black Hood in this chest, and there's also no Candle Tree Wooden Shield, so 2 empty chests right next to each other. Later, there is no Raptor Talons in this chest right here, and shortly after, there's no Skeleton Mask, and no Raptor's Black Feathers in these chests either. However, I was informed that you can get the Raptor's Black Feathers by changing the Bandit garb with the Sewing Kit. And it even is named that still. So technically it is still in the game. However, I don't know if it actually has the jump attack effect on it. Now of course this area has 2 bosses, so going to the first one, the Necromancer. It's actually called Gareth instead of Garrus. There's no skeletons that harass you in this area. And it also seems like it's not doing anything with its Ash of War. So as a result, this boss is actually not threatening at all. It actually can be if you're not super over leveled or anything. For the next boss, the music glitched again and started playing the song Made Away. Otherwise, it seemed pretty much the same, but the drop that it has, the Concealing Veil, is called Dark Silver Veil. And along with that, in the description for 1.0 it says that it hides you at a distance, but doesn't mention crouching like it does in their post-release. So I don't know if that means that it actually does hide you without having to crouch, or if it's just not something that was included in text. I did have a Golem's Halberd dropped, but it was called Golem's Pole Arm in 1.0. The Ritual Sword Talisman was called Champion's Sword Talisman. The Great Shield Talisman was called Shield Talisman. In the Windham Ruins, the Tibia Mariner boss, or what's supposed to be called, their giant skeleton they summon actually is able to hit the boss and stagger it, but it only does a little bit of damage. It doesn't do that much to them. But that's definitely not a thing that happens in current patch. And when you kill it, the Tibia summons is actually called the Law of the Undying. Going on to the Windham Catacombs, for some reason the capital Outskirts pop-up shows up down here, which doesn't make any sense. It's very far away from the Outskirts, so yeah, it beats me that one. The imps that throw lightning pots on the floor here, those pots tend to go through the floor, but they do hit me whenever they hit me directly, but they don't hit the floor at all, they just seem to go through it. So I wonder if maybe the water has some kind of weird clipping interaction with these pots that end up it not only not doing the lightning splash, but also just goes through the floor. Similarly, the lightning traps that shoots arrows to the water don't spread out as it's normally supposed to do, they just kind of hit the floor normally. So a lot of these lightning traps are pretty suboptimal. You can still find the perfume bottle at the Omen camp here. Shared order is called Haligtree Vow. The Falling Star Beast in Altus is the same, except he's playing the dragon theme. In the Perfumer's Grotto, I noticed that the Perfumers have a bluish shield for that one thing that's supposed to reduce the next attack that they take. And as you can see, our bulb is also blue. There's the more empty chest here. There's lacking a perfume bottle and a living jar shard. And for the boss, Everything seemed the same except, as we discussed in Liurnia, the old Miquella are called Forsaken in this version. Great Heal was called Medium Heal. There's no difference in the normal second church, but if you come here with Yura's quest done, the Blood Noble will still spawn as Yura's here. Even when he dies, Yura will still track you with his head, looking at you, but more or less everything else is the same. Eleanor still drops the Purifying Crystal Tear. But I should warn you that you can miss this invasion and the drops if you don't do Yura's questline before Morgoth. It just won't spawn in Lenora if you haven't done Yura's questline. So if you really want the tear or the pole blade, do it before that. Now going more north into the Altus Plateau, the Altus Plateau merchant has this stock, which if you notice has infinite viable golems, great arrows. Normally you have to farm them, and they're very unreliable to farm, so grab them if you want them, especially if you're going to upatch after this. The warp tower next to the merchant takes you to a slightly different spot. It actually takes you closer to the windmill village, the Peninsula, instead of putting you on the other side of the bridge. Which in a way could be useful, but given that there's a grace in that village, I would say it's probably not as useful as just having this warp tower to be able to get across to the other part of the bridge faster. And another character actually went back and checked on Gold Mask and attacked him in his initial spawn point. And he actually leaves a corpse model behind, which I find really interesting. He doesn't just disappear entirely. But if you reload, he still comes back to life. Whenever I killed this giant blood slime thingy, its body actually didn't disappear, it just kind of flattened and then stayed there. And I even tried to reload it and see if that would disappear, but no, it's still there. So I guess these just have a body afterwards, which is, I guess fine, but very distracting. I couldn't find the Radiant Gold Mask here, and unfortunately I didn't find it later on in the game either. You get the Golden Slam Ash of War from this Scarab, which normally drops a Summerstone 5 in post-release, and the one that normally drops it in post-release just doesn't exist. I couldn't find the Icon Shield in 1.0. The Nomadic Cookbook in 19 is in a slightly different spot. I kept a close eye on the Mirage Rise riddle. Whenever you touch the phantoms, quote unquote, you don't have an animation for actually touching them, it just goes away. A funnier thing I noticed though, is that if you come back without doing the puzzle yet, and the tower's already disappeared, it'll have the mirage effect to it again. But if you get close to it, it won't actually disappear. So you can see this very low texture, just delusion of it. You can go right through it. It's not a physical object. And even if you do finish the puzzle and come back here, you can still see it from far away and get close. It's pretty interesting. Unseen Blade was called Conceal Armament. Similarly, Unsealed Form was called Conceal Presence. The boss fight for the Worm Face seemed the same, but it is playing the dragon theme, because of course it is. In the Altus Tunnel, I couldn't find the Arsenal Charm +1. To the old Altus Tunnel, I could not find the Bolt Drake Talisman +1 in here, or the Troll Hammer. Now making our way to the Shaded Castle and the surrounding areas. First thing you can see right away when you get to the Shaded Castle is that there's some areas where the textures are just not there. It's literally just a white geometry. And reloading doesn't fix or anything, it's just how it is. So again, very clearly unpolished version of the game, with some things straight up missing. Around the corner when fighting Malay Marias, I noticed that their attacks cause bleed from their Antspur Rapier, which definitely made me curious right away to see if the item that it dropped would be causing bleed. And sure enough, once it dropped it does say that it causes hemorrhage. Which is interesting because even the description mentions that it has Scarlet Rot in it. So, oh, and it also doesn't drop its set, the Mariah set. Now going inside the Shaded Castle, some of the textures are also goofed inside of it. The Depraved Perfumer's Trousers, but they're called Fallen Perfumer's Trousers. There's normally a perfume bottle right here, but it's not there. I did find a ceremonial pot here, which I don't believe it's supposed to be there normally. When I first got here in the serialized version of 1.0 videos, I originally found Patches just standing here and wouldn't say a thing. I assume it's because of the time I hadn't done this quest line, because now that I have done it, in this new revamp of the video, he actually does give me a dialogue, except it's the one he gives you whenever he's hiding out and trying to lure you out to push you down the cliff edge. So clearly this is bugged, which he still has, by the way, in Mount Gelmir, so I won't mention it then, it's the same. Obviously he has a quest line now in the Shaded Castle, but that wasn't added into a later patch. Now when we're actually doing the Elmer fight, it's playing the Grave Warden song instead of the Fallen Knights song. When killing it, it doesn't drop the Great Shield, only the Executioner Sword, which is kind of for trophies, so let's hope that still counts. When I was looking through the windmill villages, I noticed that that's a little bit of an error in the east and west windmill pastures labels. As you can see, the west one is not in the east, and the east is not in the west, and there's one label that's missing entirely, but Just these two alone are really funny. It really has some Weast energy. The Navy Hood was called Navy Cloak. The Battle Mage is normally in Altus Plateau to drop his set. Isn't here at all, but you can farm it from different Battle Mage enemies. So it's safe to say you can get the set anyway, it's just not a guaranteed drop. At the Windmill Village, you could summon Millicent at the Grace instead of near the boss. There's no Celebrant Skull in 1.0. When I got to the Godskin Apostle, it actually is playing the right song this time, the Godskin Apostle song. Which is really weird because we already had a Godskin Apostle, and that one's playing a different song, the one in Divine Tower. So I don't know what's up with that. It's not even a Noble versus Apostle situation, it's just the same enemy. Pest Thread, it's called Swarm of Threads. And after getting it, I didn't get any special dialogue from Gowry. He just kind of acted as normal. You can still kill Millicent here for the Millicent's prosthesis. And it should be the same except it has the Valkyrie's prosthesis design, which kind of makes sense. But to not confuse the items, it's probably a good change. She also says an additional thank you at the end of her dialogue, which she doesn't in post-release, though it gets cut off on its own.
What you have done.
Ow. You can also still get the Canvas Talisman. The only difference is he has a kind of a buggy death once you kill him. You can still get the Lava Tear from the Land Guardian Mimic. In the Highway Lookout Tower, where the Great Bow is, there's even more missing textures, although these ones aren't completely white. In the Hero's Grave, the Black Knife Assassin in front of the area doesn't have a health bar for a boss. It doesn't have the music playing or anything. But whenever I actually killed it, it still had the enemy failed prompt in it, so that was definitely very confusing. Nothing to comment on the Black Knife as far as I can tell. Inside the Hero's Grave, there's no Leyndell Soldier Ashes, and there's no Let's Get To It Praline Path carving, as expected. For some reason, there's a Celestial Dew in this Sword Hill, when obviously it's not there in release. The Stormcaller Church is called Stormcaller Chapel. I noticed that the dual Tree Sentinels both have torches instead of one having a torch and one having the Great Shield. And whenever I killed both as normal, they didn't drop the Hero Rune, but they did drop the Erdtree Great Shield, only that the Golden Retaliation Ash of War is called Golden Deflection or Magical Reversal in the description. The Bridge of Iniquity Grace is called the Black Scarred Bridge instead. That's the one that's right after the bridge that connects Altus to Mount Gelmir. Anastasia does still drop the Butchering Knife, but it's not sacred at 1.0, it's just regular. The Corpse Stench Shack is called Sufferer's Shack. And as you probably saw, Golden Vow is named Erdtree Vow, just like the Ash of War. This Somber 6 right here is a Sacrament of Bud in 1.0. The pulley bow isn't where it's supposed to be, and these 5 arrows are a little bit higher. They're supposed to be below, in the air right below this. Let's check out the Gelmir's Hero's Grave. And here, this Mantis doesn't drop the Mantis Blade, or at least it's not a set drop, maybe you can farm it. This Bloodhound Knight drops the Steel Wire Torch, which was missing from Castle, so I guess we found it, yay. Didn't have to lose a neat Bastion for that or anything. But turns out I got lucky because this is actually a farmed drop. You can also farm the Bloodhound Claws from these, which obviously will become important a little bit later as well. And right next to it, the corpse that's supposed to have the Gelmir's Knight set is empty, so another empty loot here. The Stone Chariot doesn't stop for you to mount it, so I found it almost impossible to do so. They made it stall in the post-release to be able to get on top of it more reliably. The Red Wolf of the Champion is called Champion's Red Wolf, which I guess that works, pretty much the same name. There's no Scavenger Scurf Sword around here, only found the Grease. I noticed these Avianid soldiers holding like a magical bomb thing. And at first they thought they might be a different variant of that enemy. But no, it turns out it's just a visual glitch. When they drop them, it still has like a fiery effect, just like a normal bomb. And their position is a little bit different. Here's the stock for the Mount Gelmir merchant. Funnily enough, this is where you find the Eye Surcoat instead of a Rykard's boss room. And also the prisoner's set. The Volcano Cave is called the Demi-Heaving Caverns. That one caught me really off guard, but pretty accurate, given the enemies that are here. And inside, the only difference I can find is that there's no coil shield. The full-grown Falling Star Beast is playing Dragon theme, just like the one in Altus. I didn't find anything different in the boss fight, but the Beast Jaw that it drops, I did notice that the Ash of War is a little bit slower to cast the thing. So once you thrust your weapon into the air, there's a slight delay for when the rocks come out of the ground. Which, knowing how annoying this weapon can be, maybe this is a little bit more balanced. This Wormface enemy that can spawn from a Mimic still drops a Lava Tear, The Haligtree spirit is also playing the dragon theme. And it normally plays the Erdtree avatar song, which I guess is fitting. Nothing different from the drops or anything. Now we're going to cover the Siofra River section. When I opened the Siofra Caverns, which they're calling this one, I noticed that the very beginning has a few missing textures, like the shaded castle as well. Inside there's no mushroom set, so not a lot of luck for all the mushroom type clothing. And the boss here is called Kindred of Decay. Both of them are. And then when they drop their item, it's called Kindred of Decay's Exaltation instead of Kindred of Rot's Exaltation. So I guess it's safe to say that in this game they're called Kindred of Decay, or at least some of these are. The Briar spells from these enemies look a little bit different. Definitely a much less polished texture and such. This enemy still drops the Prelate's Inferno Crozier, but it's called a Flame Crozier. On top of the tower, the chest right here is supposed to be empty and open, but normally you get a hint here of the loot being somewhere else in the top of the tower. But in 1.0 you don't get that at all. You just get here, there's an open chest. If you don't look around, you're not going to find the Flame Scorpion Charm. The Magma Worm in this lava lake is also playing Dragon theme, as we've seen before. Magma Breath is called Magma Worm's Belch in 1.0. After finishing his dialogue, Alexander kind of bugged out and just started repeating this line without me interacting with him. I don't believe that happened the first time, so I don't know how replicable it is. If there's any fans of the Hierodas Glintstone Crown, it's not here unfortunately in 1.0. The You're Beautiful carving is here, which is definitely surprising since we haven't found any other ones. But it's obviously relating to Bach's questline.
You're beautiful.
Demi-Human Queen Maggie is also playing Dragon theme. Certainly seems like Mount Gelmir likes that song a lot. And right around the corner is of course Comet Azure. But funny thing is, first of all, it actually gives you the spell instantly instead of having the animation for the hand opening the whole time. But the spell is called Dark Bolide, which definitely caught me off guard. And finally, you can actually see his staff on his model when it's normally not there in release. And thankfully, now that we have this, we can actually go through the rest of Selen's questline, so we're going to do that now. Making our way to the Stars of Ruin. The animation thing's the same, but the spell is called...
Pleiades.
Likewise, Luzad is also holding his staff, when he normally doesn't. Whenever we go get Selen's Primal Glintstone, she actually starts screaming as soon as you activate the prompt to do so. But obviously the voice acting prompt just starts a little early. And whenever I went to give the glintstone to the new body, she didn't really react when I hit the prompt. And then a couple seconds later, she started talking without moving, so that was really creepy out of nowhere. I assume the animation was supposed to play, and that's why there's a little bit of delay before the talk prompt comes up. Maybe it's a bug, who knows. I do want to point out too that in 1.0, you don't have to talk to Jera until this point of the questline to be able to trigger the next phase. At least down here in the shackled body. The signs for summoning are both red in this case, so if you want to be sure, just click it once and you should see who's you're going to be helping. Going into the actual invasion thing, Jaren just kind of stands at the back of the room and doesn't walk towards you until you get close. And even when you do, you need to stay close, I guess. Which something similar happened with part of Yura's questline too, so. Although in this version, Selen doesn't attack, but she can still be killed. And the invasion won't fail necessarily, so I don't know if she is supposed to attack, but it's bugged somehow. But the fact she's just still here kind of makes you think it's like it's part of the state after the fight, but who knows. After succeeding, Renala won't be hiding. She'll actually be visible whenever Selen claims that she's gone. So it's a lot more funny even than the post-release version. And then after she meets her tragic fate, the witch's glintstone crown is called the Grana Stone Mask. So yeah, with that, that's Selen's questline. I didn't notice anything different that I haven't mentioned really. The dialogues seem all the same to me. So moving on back. Now before going to the Volcano Manor proper, let's get kidnapped by the Abductor Virgin to get into the kind of off part of the Volcano Manor level. Before you ask, yes, you still can do the skip to get down there. The Grace here is called a Subterranean Torture Chamber instead of Inquisitor Chamber. And one funny thing I noticed a long time ago is that the lava in this particular segment doesn't cause damage. I tested all the lava I could find thus far, and this is the only one that doesn't do damage. If you pan your camera a little bit below, you can see that the lava is kind of a little offset from the ground. So my working theory is that maybe the feet are the point where the lava is supposed to cause damage, but because it's a little risen over that, it doesn't. Now why it doesn't cause damage as you fall through it, I don't know, but who knows. Maybe y'all can think of another programming theory why this works like this. And everything seemed the same about the double fight, but the Inquisitor's Girandol is called Torturer's Girandol instead. Alright, now for the Volcano Manor proper. The troll rat at the entrance still has the Madness Frenzy attack, but the look of it is very, very different. When I enter the actual building, I notice that it's only playing the Stormveil theme, which so far 1.0 seems to just take as a generic castle theme. We've heard it a couple times before. And it's unfortunate because the Volcano Manor song is actually one of the better ambient musics, at least to my ear. So that's a little sad. Going upstairs, the Inquisitor Giza is called Torturer Giza. So I'm sure you've seen the pattern now. That Inquisitors are just a little bit of censored name, I suppose. Inquisitor is, I guess, a decent enough description of a torturer, but, you know, maybe a little bit more implied. The perfume bottle in this room is still there. This ghost in the corner that tells you about the Serpent Hunter, you have to get a lot closer for it to start doing its dialogue.
Someone please kill him.
In the post-release version, you can be pretty much at the end of the hall and you'll start hearing the dialogue. Small difference, but one I noticed. When you get the letters for the invasion spots, even in the description it tells you that it'll mark the map, but once you actually check it, it does not actually show you where to invade at all. Which the spots are the same as post-release, but assuming you're playing this 1.0 first playthrough, you will not know where to find these. But taking a minute to do these, Old Knight Istvan is called the Stone Knight Istvan for some reason. The scale armor that it drops is called the Drake's scale armor instead. In the next invasion, Relay doesn't have rot in his dagger, predictably, as we discussed in a prior part. He also doesn't drop the bolts after the invasion, but that's, you know, very minor change. Great Horn Trigoth is just called Horn Trigoth instead. The Depraved Perfumer's Carman Ashes is called Fallen Perfumers, just like the set we discussed in Altus as well. This pseudo illusory wall still breaks after you hit it with enough damage, which I guess makes sense since it was still in post-release. As you can probably guess from earlier, this Bloodhound Knight doesn't drop the claws, but allegedly you can farm it from this one as well, just like the other one. The Prison Town Church Grace is called Prison Town Parish, and when coming outside to the actual proper level, it's still playing the Stormveil music, which is replaced by the Prison Town song in post-release. Originally, I didn't get an Omen Killer Cleaver from either of the two Omen Killers in Volcano Manor dungeon, but I did have one drop this time. So it seems like these can just be farmed. While I'm talking about this little segment, yes, the frog head is here, if you so wanted. There is no Erdtree seal in the village. And around the lava segment, there's no smoldering shield either. So certainly a lot of missing items here. The Black Dumpling headpiece is called Black Cowl. Going forward to the Godskin Noble fight, it seems pretty much the same. I didn't notice anything different, besides maybe the usual slightly unpolished particle effects or whatever for the Black Flame. One thing I did notice that I kind of liked though was that the charge poke attack that it does actually has like a wind effect behind it when it does it. It's kind of cool. That's not a thing in the post-release. For the second segment of the Volcano Manor level, there's actually nothing different. Only thing I noticed that there's no Dagger Talisman past the Stone Key Foggate. Before we actually do the fight itself, there's a couple of things for the Serpent Hunter that I need to point out. If you go to Rykard's boss room, grab the Serpent Hunter, leave, and then upgrade your Serpent Hunter to at least +1, the game actually respawns the weapon, meaning you can effectively dupe it. And you can do this as many times as you want. This probably works this way because the game flags the Serpent Hunter +1 as a different weapon, so it respawns the weapon for you as it detects it's not in your inventory. Most of the moveset seems pretty much the same from what I could tell. The one thing I do know for sure though is that the L2, the Ash of War, you can actually press and let go immediately for a quick jab, which doesn't seem that useful honestly when I actually try in a fight. It's not necessarily that much of a interesting change necessarily, but it is obviously something I wanted to point out. But even more interestingly, but maybe equally as disappointingly, is that once you do the fully charged L2 once, you can't stop the second swing after the first one. So if I do the fully charged, it's always going to follow up with a second on its own. You kind of have to take my word on it, but it is how it works. So you can't do the thing you can do in some of the older patches where you can just do the first L2 to stagger, and then without doing the full follow-up, you do the L2 first swing again to stagger again. So you can't cheese it in 1.0, unfortunately. For the fight itself, Godrun Serpent seems pretty much identical. The only thing I noticed is that the lava effect is quite buggy. It seems like the lava is also offset but below the ground a little bit. So sometimes the rocks will stick out, which looks kind of bad sometimes. But getting into phase 2, you actually have a surprising name change. Instead of being Rykard Lord of Blasphemy, it's Rykard Recusant Shardbearer, which I guess is fitting. He is the leader of the Recusants as well. Likewise, the fight seems pretty much the same. So just going forward until when you kill him, he drops the Remembrance of the Recusant instead of the Remembrance of the Blasphemous. And on a similar note, the grace is called Recusant Serpent instead of Lord of Blasphemy. So yeah, I guess this has a lot more emphasis on him being the recusant faction leader or something. The Blasphemous Blade Ash of War goes much faster. That should caught me off guard how fast it went. After doing all that, I did try to do Patches' questline thing, but the thing he has with Tanith later on wasn't added into a later patch. So technically his questline ends here, but the problem is that he actually disappears entirely, as far as I can tell. I wasn't able to find him anymore. So if you need anything from him, do it before this part of the questline. When you kill Tanith, she doesn't drop her set. And Tanith's knight that invades is called Ordovis of the Crucible, which is definitely wrong. That's a knight later on. Since we're here and they have the Serpent Hunter now, let's quickly discuss the chainsaw glitch. So normally for speedruns, the PC users will do something with the keyboard, which obviously we can't do because we're in console. But there are other methods to do it that don't require keyboard, that just tend to be slower. So I learned and tried one of them, and it looks like it does work. The controlling of it is a little bit janky, like it normally is in general. But if you want to do it 1.0 console, there you go, you can do it. The Outer Wall Phantom Tree Grace is called Outer Wall Spectre Wood in 1.0, which I suppose has the same sentiment. The Wind Crystal tier is in the Minor Erdtree Church, meaning that the Golden Order seal is missing currently. In here as well, there are smaller trees on the sides of the church that clip through the walls, when they don't in the post-release version of course. There's no differences inside the sealed tunnel, but I did notice that the Divine Tower of West Altus doesn't have a grace at the beginning, so you will have to go through the tunnel from the beginning if you don't have the Rykard's Great Rune. There was a grace at the top, but it's pretty pointless at that point, since you can't even enter without the Great Rune. The Valiant Gargoyle you encounter going up the Outskirts stairs doesn't drop the Gargoyle's Great Axe when killed. But I did find a Gargoyle later that did drop this weapon, so it seems that it's just not a set drop. You have to farm it, which is unfortunate because they don't respawn. The Golden Parry Ash of War is called Erdtree Bulwark, and when testing it out, you can see that the parry effect is very different. It seems to work the same though, having the extended parry range. When encountering the Margit illusion in the Outskirts, he doesn't have the initial line of "I see thee, little tarnished." As you can hear by now as well, this plays a dragon theme, which is wrong on multiple levels, because this isn't considered a boss fight, there's no health bar even in 1.0, and normally no song plays here in post-release, besides the usual area theme at least. When killed, he dropped America's Scar Seal instead of Viridian Amber Medallion +1, which means we found this Scar Seal finally, but we lost another talisman in return. There's some troll enemies that were added in post-release that weren't there in 1.0. Now we're going to go into the Alriza Hero's Grave. There are no Vulgar Militia Ashes in 1.0, the Crucible Feather Talisman is also missing, and the Scripture Wooden Shield is inscribed Round Shield. And going forward into the boss, the Crucible Knights are way closer to the entrance. Despite this, only the Spear Crucible aggroed at first, meaning that if you're careful you can actually fight them separately if you stay in the right corner of the room. You can even sneak around the other knight in order to get a free hit. As you might have noticed by now, the names of both of them is different as well, notably the Greatsword one is nameless. As we saw in Mount Gelmir, Ordovis is designated to be another Crucible Knight, and they played the Grave Warden song instead of Erdtree Knights. Lastly, before going into Leyndell proper, we're going to look at the Alriza side tomb catacombs. There is no cracked pots near the Perfumer's Cookbook, normally there's 2 here. There's no ceremonial pot here in 1.0, it's replaced by rot resin, which is normally on the side of the same room. I got some slow loading after warping in some of the chests, so I could see through the floor and walls at times. I haven't seen this in post-release ever. There's no cracked pots in the other water part either, that's another 2 gone. And there's no ritual pot here either, replaced by a smithing stone. This is the Capital Outskirts merchant stock. The spot where the wing tier is moved to in post-release is empty in 1.0. The enemies surrounding the Omen and the Minor Erdtree that use Deathlight have the purple effect that the Basilisk share in 1.0, along with having a blue sphere particle effect thing. The Draconic Tree Sentinel is mostly the same, the particle effects on the lightning is a little bit different as usual, but I did notice that the Honed Bolt attack is a lot more delayed. Alright, we're now at Leyndell proper. Bok still shows up here, but there seems to be no way to continue his questline. He doesn't have any additional dialogue, and this actually remains like this for the rest of the game. He will actually just completely disappear when you get the Ashen Capital. So I guess this is the end of his questline, even though there's not much else to do. His services are still available until then. Right away as we head into the level proper, we see that the Imp enemies replace the Oracle Envoy enemies in 1.0. They start off passive, so they're not hard to deal with for now. There's a full body gargoyle like there is later in the level normally, the Sword and Halberd one. This one also doesn't drop anything, and it replaces the bigger Envoy enemy. The half gargoyle enemy's perfume attack doesn't have sound effects in 1.0. I thought it might have been a bug, but it kept happening, so I assume it's just a 1.0 feature. You find the perfume bottle here, which is a cave moss in the release version, and the chest that normally has the bottle is empty, as per usual. There's a cracked pot here, which is normally the upper class robe, so I guess that's missing for now as well. In this building exit, there's a banished knight at the doorway, which is normally a Leyndell knight. And on a similar note, the Leyndell knight at this door is a dual-wielding banished knight, which is very scary to see, being one of the most dangerous enemies in the game. If you're wondering, you can farm the cloaked banished knight armor from this guy. I tried and did get his chest piece, and relatively quickly too, but I was probably just lucky. This is where this one is on the map if you want to see specifically, but there will be ones later on that are easier to farm if you want to wait for that. And the ambushing foot soldier isn't here at all. This ambushing foot soldier near this item is replaced by an exile soldier, so yet another entire enemy variant here. The sitting Leyndell knight here is missing altogether. There's a second Nurtree avatar that spawns in the opposite side of the avenue balcony, the path that leads to the Forbidden Lands, and both spawn simultaneously when you trigger either of them. I got a random tree lose its textures at some point, but I think it was due to the Nurtree avatar messing around under it, unsure if it's replicable. After killing both the avatars, neither of them dropped a rune item like the singular one does in post-release. And this rune near the Crucible Knight is much smaller. In this corner of the streets, there's normally nothing here, but there's some exile soldiers in 1.0. Around the corner from there, there's a banished knight with an exile soldier, which replaces an almost identical setup. On the opposite side, there's a trumpet exile soldier, just like the trumpet Leyndell soldier in the release. There is a lone banished knight in the corner of the street, which are normally a bunch of foot soldiers that are called by the trumpet guy. This corner also normally has the imp head, but it's not there in 1.0. I did get a cat head drop from an imp earlier, so it's possible these are farm items now. In this raised street garden area that you have to drop down to, there's more exile soldiers, one is even sobbing at the door or something, which is replaced by a singular Leyndell knight in post-release. Near this chalice in the lower floor of the streets, there's a handful of exile soldiers in 1.0, which replaces a bow Leyndell knight and a perfumer. There's no enemies at all in this stairway, the one that's a shortcut to this area from later. Up these stairs, there's more exile soldiers, replacing perfumers and foot soldiers, and also one of them dropped its greaves, but they're called the banished greaves instead of exile greaves, which is funny because I had a normal banished knight soldier drop and it was named the same. There's some exile soldiers on the path to the half gargoyle in the ashes, which replaces some Leyndell soldiers. There's a few more groups of those. The gargoyle is surrounded by imps, which was awful. There's even one that ambushes you from behind. The patrolling Leyndell knight here is missing entirely. There's an exile soldier ready to ambush you around this corner in 1.0. Release has an identical setup but with a Leyndell soldier. There's a patrolling banished knight with exile soldiers in 1.0. There's no enemies in this upper chalice, but this is where the patrolling enemies in last point start. Normally there's a bunch of Leyndell knights. There's a perfumer plus Spanish knight combo where the lion normally is, which is an effective duo apparently. And I say normally because the lion isn't there at all, though the perfumer was there the whole time just behind the structure. There's a ceremonial pod where the black bow is supposed to be, so the black bow is missing now. Fortunately, it's a good bow as well. There's banished knights and exiles in this room, replacing foot soldiers. There's a dual-wielding banished knight instead of the Leyndell knight in the room next to the tree spirit, though they're in different spots. The crackpot is still in the same spot though. The Omen Killer doesn't drop its mask like in post-release version. In this building, there's no bed with the Lionel set and the deathbed dress. There's no Albinauric enemies to ambush you near the Thunderbolt scarab, it's just free. There's also no Albinauric ambush in this sewer segment. The spot that normally has the Guilty Hood just has rustic volcano stones, 1.0 version's formic rocks. The corpse that has the Earthsteel dagger is empty. This little pathway doesn't have the Albinauric covering it, so there's just no Albinaurics at all in Leyndell it seems. And the corpse at the end does have the pickled turtleneck. The Leyndell Knights from Avenue Balcony are replaced by a bunch of exile soldiers. This also means there's no archer at the back. There's a banished knight along with an exile at the very end of the pathway, when normally this segment is empty. When you jump off of Grand Sax's wing to progress through the level, there's an imp waiting at the bottom to ambush you. Definitely unnecessary. There's no Leyndell Knight near the compound stones here. There are some more imp enemies right before the West Grace, instead of the singular soldier ambush. Definitely very unnecessary. 3 of these right before Grace is very dirty. There's a high page added in this stairway near the cane sword, when there's normally no enemy here. Speaking of the cane sword, that is missing as well. There's oracle enemies missing near the lever that leads back to the balcony area. Near the gold seed tree as well, they're replaced by imps again. The gargoyle is still there, but it's the axe version instead. When he does his roar attack, a second axe loaded into his other hand, but it seems like it was just a visual glitch. This gargoyle also doesn't drop anything, it's supposed to drop its halberd. They put an imp enemy near the normal high page that's here, which is the last straw. From stuff is dead to me, and I'm thankful that this isn't the release version of Leyndell, as interesting as all these changes are. Similar to the sword one, the ritual shield talisman is called Champion Shield Talisman in 1.0. Near Grand Tex's Talon, all the Leyndell enemies are replaced by a singular Banished Knight, meaning that the Gravel Stone Seal isn't dropped by the enemy here, and is currently missing. During Bernal's invasion, Bernal himself doesn't really pursue the enemy, and Wilhelm doesn't either, he kinda stands back. So Wilhelm just kinda casts at nothing in the back of the room, making him a non-issue if you just stay where you spawn. The only other difference I noticed is that Godslayer Greatsword Ash of War is stupidly slow compared to what it is now at least. The ore from the invasion and Bernal are the same, except the Raging Wolf set is named Bloody Wolf. The Finger Maiden's Prayer Book, which is normally named Two Finger Prayer Book, is where the Alberic's set is. And the spot where the Two Finger Book is normally is just empty. Lord's Aid is called Two Fingers Aid in 1.0. There's no hammer near Hugh's spot, only the Wet Blade. The Erdtree Seal is near Fia's bed instead of in Mount Gelmir, which is a ruin in post-release, so thankfully we did find one of the missing mage items. This seal actually scales entirely from intelligence instead of faith for some reason. The Coated Sword has Sacred Blade instead of the unique Ash of War that allows you to go through shields. There's exile soldiers fighting an abductor version in the courtyard. The abductor is normally there, but not the exiles. The second abductor version that's normally in the hallway is missing entirely. There's no Stormhawk Axe here in 1.0, but I did check if Nepheli still drops hers, and she does. Both of them. And since we now have the painting for it, I went back to Altus to check the painters for Fire's Deadly Sin, and that is the same, but the image is slightly different. The flame is brighter. The Flower Guardian enemies seem to be the same going up the routes, but the singular one in front of Godfrey's shade isn't there. Godfrey seemed the same to me. He still dropped the talisman patch as well, so we have a 4 now. On the top floor of the Erdtree Sanctuary, there's no chest with the Erdtree bow in 1.0. The Golden Order Principia is still there, but it's called the Golden Order Prayer Book to match the rest of them. Looking at the incantations you get from it, the Radagon's Rings of Light is called Divine Loss Punishment. The Law of Regressions puzzle doesn't have a note hinting at the usage of this spell, so the only hint that I know of is the Turtle Pope's dialogue about Radagon. It still works the same, but you have to be right in front of the statue to pull it off. And there's also no note pointing out the discovery. The questline proceeds the same though, except from Corrin's new spells, Immutable Shield is called Divine Loss Shield. Back in the regression area, some Banished Knight and Exiles replace the Perfumers there. The Crucible Knight is patrolled from the beginning, starting closer to where you are, but there's no difference besides that. The Barrier of Gold Scarab is visible and stationary, and the design of the incantation is different. Okay, let's take a look-see at Morgott now. In the cutscene, when Morgott is cracking his cane open, there's like a fiery effect unveiling the weapon, which was how this was on release, and it was changed later on in a patch. Just like the market fight, it is playing Millennia's theme. Also, he's named Morgott Prince of the Omen instead of the Omen King. Melano doesn't drop an additional Erdtree heal on death. The original Margit death dialogue does play if you die in phase 1. When doing the bleed delayed attack, the bleed slash effect disappears before the explosion. Phase 2 death dialogue has an additional line that gets cut off before it can finish. This is probably why it was cut too. The Remembrance is also called the Omen Prince. And Morgott talks to you on his own after death, you don't have to interact with him. The 2 different dialogues you can get from him normally are just mixed into one.
Not but a fool. We are all forsaken. None may claim the title of Elden Lord.
Inspecting the Thorn Door, the dialogue box says the Erdtree refuses all in 1.0. Instead of impenetrable thorns refuse all, none may enter the Erdtree. When Melano talks to you after resting, the spoken dialogue varies slightly from the text on screen.
To the forge of the flame of ruin, far above the clouds, upon the snowy mountaintops of the giants. Then the impenetrable thorns can be burned away, and I can guide you down the path to becoming Elden Lord.
But the message is more or less the same. If you reload the area in 1.0, the demigod thrones respawn, but they're intangible. Still pretty cool though, since you don't normally get to inspect them at all. The Regal Omen Baron is called Regal Scapegoat Baron. When first opening the gate that's right after the well, I immediately got the Subterranean Shining Grounds prompt, which is definitely different from current patch that shows up later, but funnily enough, it actually shows up again where it's supposed to, but it seems to be the sub-area kind of font, because it's a little bit smaller than normal. There is no blood-soaked set, the ones next to the rune. The Shadow Bait incantation is called Distraction. Very magical spell, indeed. You can still find the Moog Shackle near the lobsters, and spoilers, it works the same way. But there's no Somberstone Scarab in this little pipe. Now let's take a look at the Leyndell Catacombs. This lootable Grave Glovewort is replaced by Moon Egg in 1.0. The Rod Resin here is replaced by Budding Moss in 1.0. The sort of illusion of the Dead Omen is still there, where you're supposed to think that you kind of loop back an enemy spawned. I just thought it was interesting to note that that's been a thing since 1.0. There's a Spirit Caller Snail still summoning enemies as normal, but this one actually leaves the body whenever it's killed. It doesn't disappear like normal. And also you have to kill the enemies again after it's dead. They don't disappear immediately. In this corpse, there's no Haligtree +1 talisman, but if you recall, we already got it earlier in the game. There's another Spirit Caller Snail a little further ahead for no reason because it didn't seem to summon any enemies. When I actually found the Dung Eater in the sewers, the dialogue and everything seems the same, and it has so far, but there's no sound effect for the Dung Eater bashing his head. Whenever you free him, he doesn't leave a note behind in the round table telling you to meet him at the moat. I did try and see if I can get Blackguard to move over to the moat as well, but it doesn't seem to be a thing yet, so this questline seems pretty incomplete. The Blackguard isn't here. Normally there's just a corpse on a chair to kind of replace him, and this one's still here, but it's a different spot. It's closer to where he come from, instead of towards the back of this area. I stalled the fight quite a bit, but Dung Eater never did his Ash of War, the Shriek of Milos, but he did use the tool spell that we mentioned earlier, the Omen Barn. Now, Dung Eater does still drop his sword, but the name of the Ash of War is Sword Art's name, 1015. This is the most blatant placeholder thing that we've seen in this entire version so far, and it was really funny and jarring to see for the first time. In the well-looking pit area, there's no Mimic Grace. The Scarab with the Somberstone isn't here either. There's no string at the end of this. A little bit further, there's no Warming Stone. Behind this Morala, there's no Poison Stones. And near these basilisks, there's no Nomad Ashes. This particular Omen normally drops the Omen Bairn, the tool spell, but it doesn't in 1.0. And in this same segment, there's no Golden Centipede loot either. Going forward to the second pipe system, there's an invisible wall in this particular end of the pipe. Normally you can actually go to the end and presumably jump off, but for whatever reason there's just a wall here. There was another title card for the Shunning Grounds that popped up whenever I was following the rat that shows you where to go. And near this living jar, there's no ritual pot. So yet another ritual pot missing. When we get to the Illusion Moog, it's actually playing the real Moog song, Moog Lord of Blood, instead of the more subdued version, Omen Illusion. It even had the phase transition part of the song, even though there's nothing extra happening, just the normal fight keeps going. No complaints from here, I like that song. But it definitely adds another layer to the whole illusion versus real Moog situation. Here's a really subtle change that you might not even noticed. The actual boss name is Moog the Fell Omen, instead of Moog the Omen. The only other change I could find is that the little explosion attack he's holding in his hand for a brief seconds doesn't show the fireball effect until he's about to explode it in front of you. But the attack's the same, it's just a visual bug. Okay, let's now make our way to the Three Fingers. You actually don't have to get as close to the structure in the back of Moog's room to open it. Pretty much as soon as you get to the chest, it'll start opening by itself. Which I actually don't mind because it can be a little bit like, oh, there's something there, and you just don't look at it closely. Something you might not know actually. There's actually another Morgott barrier here, blocking you from going to the Frenzy Flame until after you defeat Morgott. However, this one is here in 1.0, unlike the Forbidden Lands one. It doesn't have any readable prompt though, it's just blocking your way. Immediately you can see that there's not any yellow embers in the ground here, which is an easy farm spot for those, so those are gone. There's no nomadic merchant set in the first breakable structure here, that has to be broken by the enemy. There's also no Eyes of Yellow in the second one you can break, and as a matter of fact, none of them have anything. So no Miquella's Needle, no later on either. The Shabiri Cookbook, which is obviously normally named Frenzied Cookbook in release, is in a different spot. It's just on one of those normal walkways, instead of in this little nook here. There's also no Fingerprint Shield. I know that's one that a lot of people like to use. But I did find the Inescapable Frenzy incantation, so that's still here. I overlapped the two cutscenes side by side, there's no differences whatsoever. And the dialogue from both Melina and Hyetta is pretty much the same. But whenever Hyetta died, the Frenzied Flame Seal was called Spark of Frenzy instead. Alongside that, she also dropped the Traveling Maidenhead Light, which the Traveling Maidenhead won't be later in the Mountaintops, so this should be the one. But unfortunately, we are missing the hood, since that didn't drop here. Flames don't appear on her corpse as she dies, but after you reload the area with the Grace resting, it does leave some flames behind. The fog effect surrounding the area, especially high above, is more of a yellow hue as opposed to brown, which look kind of nice at some points, but obviously this probably shouldn't look as nice as it does, being some like decaying root area that's effectively cursed. The Queen on the top here doesn't drop anything, just like the previous ones you've seen in the series, and they won't for the rest of the area either, so that's just a constant change from the 1.0 version. The loot in this particular area that's supposed to be a Smithing Stone 5 is now a Grace Mimic in 1.0, and similarly the forming rock here is a Sanctuary Stone. Reaching stable ground, we can see that there's no Erdtree avatar in this segment of the Deeproot Depths, meaning that you can't get the Staff of the Avatar either. Golden Land Scarab still drops the Ash of War, but it's called the Golden Land. The Smithing Stone 6 on these roots right here is a Blood Rose in 1.0. And after the Ant Cave, Elden Star is actually called Ancient Elden Will, which is definitely an interesting name for it. The Runebear that you fight in the waterfall doesn't drop the Princess of Death's Assist. In the water here, there's no Somber Stone 6 Scarab. There's also no Vacuum Slice near this half gargoyle, but I do want to remind y'all that we did get it in the Valiant Gargoyles fight in Siofra River already. In this segment of coffins, so there's a bunch of items. I believe most of them were the same except for the Human Bone Shard, which was replaced by a Silver Tear Husk. Apparently the Mausoleum Greaves are called Tombsmen Greaves, and the Mausoleum Knights armor is called Tomb Knight armor. So I guess we can assume the Mausoleum Soldiers are called Tombsmen and the Knights are called Tomb Knights. The Somber 6 that's normally in this structure is actually just a Living Jar Shard. There's no Mausoleum Soldier Ashes in this corner of the map. There's not even a tree here. And there's no Somber 6 Scarab in this branch right here. Going for the Crucible Knight Liurnia. Apparently this just isn't a boss in this version. There's no boss health bar. There's no boss music playing here. Just a normal environmental music. And the health seems very small for a boss fight too. So it's just, I guess later on decided to be a boss fight. It's now just a normal enemy. With this, you could maybe assume this is supposed to be Liurnia, but it still drops as Liurnia's tree, so perhaps it is, just not named in particular. Liurnia's tree has a wind effect instead of golden waves. Given that the Crucible Knights do have the gold effect, this is definitely interesting. Does make me curious if it does physical damage or something instead of holy. And the Crucible tree set in the back is still there, thankfully. Now going up the roots up to Fia's Champion. There's a bunch of half gargoyles here, and I do want to point out that they're still bugged. Most of them still don't make any sound whatsoever whenever they're doing the perfume attack. But some of them actually have the sound effect for the giant skeleton laser beam that the Tibia Mariners' summons do. This one right here does it, and also this one up ahead. So that was kind of terrifying, but ultimately the same as usual. And there's also no Prince of Death's staff. Now coming up in Fia's Champions, the fog walls that surround the arena spawn immediately instead of fading in like they normally should. The actual champions don't spawn in with the cool effect that surrounds them, they just kind of fade in. There's no music playing here either, like in the Crucible Knight earlier, even though this is a boss fight, when they normally play the Immured song. The first summon seemed the same, but for the second, Rogier didn't seem to be able to wield his rapier, because it tried to do the Ash of War and it couldn't do it, but he did do the follow-up attack for it, so that was weird. And the third round of summons seemed the same as well. Not much comment on there. However, when they died, they still dropped Fia's Mist, but it's called Prince of Death's Blessing. Upon reading the description and stuff, it seems to be describing Deathbite as instant death. And then when checking the help menu for some of the things, it does seem to be calling that status effect as instant death, which is accurate, but a little on the nose I suppose. I did also try the spell, and it seems to last a lot longer. It was around 17 seconds instead of 7. If PvP was doable in 1.0, this would be pretty nice actually. Pretty good area denial, but can't really do that, can we? The teleport in the back of the room actually sends you to the Divine Bridge area of Leyndell instead of the beginning of it, which is very interesting because it's just supposed to act as a different way to get into Leyndell that bypasses the Draconic Tree Sentinel. So it seems much more useless unless you can somehow get down the elevator. But I actually learned something new from this. Killing the Shard Bearers isn't enough to flag the game to let you use this portal. You actually need to activate them as well in their towers to be able to use it, which is very interesting for sure. We are now going to be doing Fia's thing where you have to get the Weathering Dagger and give it to D and all that so she can go to her spot for 46. As we did that, I noticed that Order's Blade that D sells you is actually called Sanctify Armament. Pretty much everything was the same, the dialogue, the way the events go about. The only difference I noticed is that whenever you show Fia the curse mark of death, she actually has a reaction to you showing it to her.
This is the other Hallowbrand. How did you... This is the other Hallowbrand. How did you...
Which I appreciate. I guess it just gives it more gravity that you actually have it. But in post-release, it just kind of seems like, oh, you have this. What? I don't know. It seems a little more appropriate to me. Now going to Fortisax. It is playing the appropriate song. The lightning spears that Fortisax throws on the ground, the AoE seems to spread out a lot faster. And I would say this is actually probably easier to dodge because there's not something you have to kind of worry about twice. If you're close enough, you can just roll both of them. When Fortisax goes into the sky to do the Landsax's Glaive type of attack, the lightning bolt doesn't actually land on his hand. He just kind of goes on the side. It's a little offset. It's kind of funny looking. But besides these and the usual unpolished effects, the boss seems pretty much the same. I couldn't find anything else different. Now we're getting the mending room from Fia. This is where you get the Prince of Death's cyst, but it's called the Prince of Death's pox. Although weirdly enough, the cyst has the same design as the pustule. Fortisax's lightning spear is called Fortisax's lance, and Death Lightning is called Fortisax's Deathstorm. To finish all of Fia's questline line and all that, I did go to the other D and gave him the first D's armor and such. The dialogue and everything seemed the same. First change I noticed is that whenever you attack him, the name of the enemy NPC is called D Hunter of the Dead instead of Beholder of Death. Which, thematically, I do think there might be some theming of split personality and such, even though they're physically two bodies. At least we think so. Have you ever seen them both in the same room? Regardless, it's a change from the post-release version. D still dropped the Inseparable Sword, and it has Imbue Holy Ash of War, which is the name of Sacred Blade in 1.0, so that's technically correct. But we never actually tried the animation of it, at least. It's doing the animation for the Order Blade or Sacred Order, instead of the little laser beam thing. So that's certainly wrong and different, but hasn't that been this whole version so far. Back in Leyndell, on the way to the Forbidden Lands. The perfume bottle is not in the corpse near the Misbegotten Warrior in 1.0. The passive dog here is still just chilling. The perfumer enemies are shuffled around a bit. They're still in the stairway instead of the one that's on the dirt area. There's a Misbegotten Warrior moved in front of the elevator towards the Forbidden Lands, which is a little bit dirty, especially because he can nag from really far away without you even noticing him. There's no Flame Drake Talisman +1 where you normally have the Morgott barrier. I noticed that the barrier that normally blocks you from Forbidden Lands before killing him actually isn't there at all in 1.0. Meaning that in theory, the only block to progression is the rolled medallion, but with the wrong warp that we know works in 1.0, we can just wrong warp to the top or rolled, meaning Morgott can be skipped easily if you're willing to glitch this. There's also no Somberstone Scarab that baits you and turns big. In the room that is totally not Melanus, there's no official's attire, but there is the Blade of Calling. When fighting the Fell Twins, the fight is identical but it's playing the dragon theme, because of course it is. And at the Divine Tower of East Altus Gate Grace is called Divine Tower Seal in 1.0. The Night Rider that drops the Phantom Slash is still here, but it's more obvious than ever that this just has normal enemy HP, because he got absolutely destroyed. The loot in the Skeleton Mouth that's normally a somber 7 is an Albinauric Blood Clot in 1.0. The Blacksblade Kindred is playing Archery Knights instead of Formidable Foe 1. Nothing seems different aside from that. In the rolled elevator, we get flashbanged for a solid 10 seconds before we can see again. After the elevator, you may notice something weird in the distance. That being that we can see ourselves in between this crack in the mountain. It's really strange. It's almost like a green screen or something. I don't know what the heck happened to make this happen, but there it is. This can happen in a few different spots as well. I didn't find any differences with Shaburi, and so he doesn't really have any other interactions. I just decided to kill him in this file. He uses Impaling Thrust in 1.0, but he never uses Ash of War in current patch, so I'm unsure if he's supposed to use Piercing Fang or not, but it's still different regardless. While we're talking about his weapon, this was very subtle and y'all may not even know, but I happened to notice that he's using the Uchigatana in current patch, when he uses Nagakiba in 1.0, and you might have noticed that they're in different hands too. Using Nagakiba makes sense of course, but if we presume that you take Yura's Nagakiba when he dies, then it would make sense that Shaburi has to use another weapon. He also didn't use any of the Friends incantations, when that's his primary attack method in release. His death dialogue gets cut off before he can finish it too.
Until we meet again.
The Zamor ruins are called Glace ruins in 1.0. Same goes for the Grace. Zamor Ice Storm is called Blizzards of Zamor. And there's no Scarab in this tree with a Somber 7. When you enter the Giant's Mountaintops catacombs, the Flame Peak prompt comes up, kinda like that one dungeon in Altus, showing up in a place that has no business being. The Giant's Mountaintop Catacombs Grace is just called Mountaintop Catacombs. There's a Stake of America inside the dungeon, but it just takes you to the stake outside, so it's definitely a bug. The sites in this room ended up breaking after I died in here, and it seems to just break if I died any place in the dungeon. There's no Origin pot in this room. The frost effect from these pillars is a very slightly darker hue. This is a series first. We can't open a chest at all here, the one that normally has the Fire Monk ashes. I'm unsure if this means that that's not in there or that it is. This is Schrodinger's chest right now. The Tree Spirit boss started already overground, when normally it's supposed to dig out first. We sort of discussed this before, but it's playing the Graveworn song instead of Earthtree Avatar song. I say sort of because I was playing a different wrong song before. After the boss, this chest with the Death Root unlocks, so I thought maybe it could unlock the other chest from earlier, but nope, it's still locked. Back outside, after the big bridge area, there's no scarab with the Somber 8 below this stone stairway thing. Here's a very curious anomaly in Millicent's dialogue.
I'm searching for a fort to the west of the ruins. I'm searching for a fort to the north of the ruins.
Now, knowing a thing or two about scripts and retakes, to me this feels like a flaw in the voice acting that somehow made it into the game. For a moment I thought it could have been more so that Millicent's final position was uncertain, but that shouldn't matter because unless the position of the Stargazer's ruins changed at some point, her relative position shouldn't matter. This is just a theory of course, and it's not a dig at the actress by any means. Whether the script was wrong or she just read it wrong on a take, mistakes like this happen. I'm just amazed that both lines made it into the shipped disc. Also, if you remember the dialogue, you may have noticed that one of the lines is missing too. The one about the master of the fort. Which makes sense that it would be added since Malenia isn't at the fort, but it leads to her. In the pile of golems, the Smithing Stone 7 is replaced by a Fulgur Bloom in 1.0. In the Shack of the Lofty, which is called War Mad Heroes Shack, there's no Traveling Maiden set. Doing the last of the Orcusan Invasion quests, Juno gets a lot closer to you before gesturing. He also uses Quick Step instead of Bloodhound Step, and he just doesn't hurt as much as he generally does. He still does bleed damage, so it could catch you off guard, but his whips tend to hurt on their own on release. If you do this quest after killing Rykard, you actually won't get the reward like in release, so it'll be lost to you. But for the purposes of the video, I verified the item and it seems identical. Here's the Mountaintop Merchant stock. Apparently there's more perfume bounties in 1.0 version that there are slots for them, which is kinda neat. This means that you don't have to go to all the very specific locations to get all of them. You can pick and choose or stumble upon enough of them naturally. There's unlimited Spirit Flame arrows, which is very nice, along with unlimited Perfumer's bolts. There's no unlimited Lightning Great bolts though, like in post-release. The Snow Valley Ruins Overlook Grace is just called Ruinvale Clifftop. The Somber 9 in this chair is just a Trena Lily. The Earthtree avatar is still split in two, so besides the usual, one of the avatars did the animation like it was cloning again, but it didn't work. I'm sure this means that it can do that normally, but it certainly tried, I guess. The Helven Steeples Ash of War is called Spectral Flame of Ruin, or Spire Sword, instead of Ruin is Ghost Flame. This Deathrite bird is finally a boss, but it's actually just called a Death Bird. Maybe it has something to do with it being able to spawn at daytime, and perhaps nighttime bosses just don't usually count for whatever reason. You can kinda choose it from this spot, but it's a little inconsistent. Moving over to Castle Soul, the Land Guardians don't drop anything when killed. They usually drop a Somber 7 and a few other things. The really dirty dual Banished Knight ambush was still a thing in 1.0, but there's no Cerulean Amber Medallion +1 after it, so it's kinda pointless coming here in this version. There's no Stormhawk Axe here either, but as we discussed, you can still get 2 from killing Nefeli. Commander Nile seemed exactly the same, except it's playing the Graveworn theme instead of Old Warriors, and also the sound effects for a lot of his attacks are different. The particle effects and lightning were also very lacking. We got the Soul Sword painting in Castle Soul, so going to the proper spot. The Great Hood is called Eskert's Great Hood, which, sure, I guess that's accurate. In the Spirit Caller's Cave, most of the items in this little cove are not there. And there's also no White Reed set here. The boss fight was identical, but they're playing Formidable Foe 1 song instead of Godskin Apostle. Unfortunate. The item drops were the same, but it didn't drop crap for runes. The Smithy Stone 7 in this chair behind the America Church is a golden centipede in 1.0. One of the enemies in here was already stuck in a rock by the time I got here. The Founding Rain of Stars is called Goliath's Rain of Stars. Here's some speculation that was done on what this could mean. The Lord Contender's Evergaol is called Consort's Evergaol, which I guess works as well. The Earthtree refuses all. Yes. Vike is named the Dragon Spear instead of Roundtable Vike. He actually fights exactly the same as his invasion counterpart in 1.0 Liurnia, including having 2 flasks heals, which was wrong then, but it's mostly correct now, except for the 2 heals, I guess. The only thing wrong now is that it still uses the Frenzy Ash of War instead of Storm Assault, which I find less frustrating anyway, so I didn't mind. He still drops the fingerprint armor, but it's called fingertip armor. In the Guardian's Garrison, the Smithing Stone 7 is a budding cave moss, and the smoldering butterflies are golden bolts. In the Giant Conquering Hero's Grave, you can still find Flame Protect Me behind the Stone Key Gate, but apparently you can also get it from the Giant's Prayer Book in the Garrison, so I guess there's 2 options to get this in New Game. The Cranial Vessel Candle Stand is called the Hallowed Candle Stand. There's no Giant Zone here, but it can be farmed from apparently any Fire Monk. I've had it drop from a few different ones, and you can get multiple. For the Samor boss, the Graveworn song is playing when it should be playing Archery Knights, but the fight seems the same. Bloodyfinger Okina is just named Okina when invading. You might notice that he's using the Bloody Slash instead of Corpse Piler, and that's because that's what Rivers of Blood has in 1.0, Bloody Slash, even though the description calls it Bloodstained Blade or Bloodrend. It's also a faith weapon in this version, but if you're looking to use it for its OP Ash of War, unfortunately you can't take advantage of it in this version. He also didn't drop his mask, so that's gone, along with the White Reed set so far. There's no Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone in the Giant Skullmouth, the max level upgrade for the normal upgrade path, which means that the first max level upgrade you can find outside of questlines is missing. This one hand got stuck on terrain as it was trying to fall, I presume, and it made the game very laggy, which happens in current patch on occasion as well, if something clips into a wall. The Smithing 7 below the hand is a Eye of Yellow 1.0. Going into the Fire Giant, I couldn't find Alexander's summon sign. I even went to check on him and he was still in Mount Gelmir, so I guess you don't summon him in this version. The fights seem identical aside from the Flame of the Fell God that has a different look, which I kinda like, to be honest. And when checking his remembrance, the Burn of Flame spell is called Wrath of the Fire Giant. When Melina is burning the Earth Tree, there's no music playing at all. The normal music is very low key, so it's not a huge change, but it's worth mentioning.
O Earth Tree, you shall burn.
Out of curiosity, I decided to check the medallions you needed to get to the Haligtree and see the descriptions and stuff, and they're actually a little bit weird. The right one is kind of accurate, I suppose. The way they describe the Albanark village is interesting. But the left one, you don't get given the medallion by Gideon. At best, he hints towards it. So I wonder if this is a change in how he got the medallion, or just an error. In the hidden path to the Haligtree, the Hero's Rune 1 that's after you drop down from the visible pathway is simply a budding cave moss. There's no Spelldrake Talisman +2 at this window. Going to the boss, the Stray Mimic tier is just called Mimic tier, which I suppose fits as well. Stray just implies that it is far from where it's supposed to be. It's playing the Gravewarden song instead of the Amir, like the previous Mimic tier we fought already as a boss. Since this finally gave us the last death route, we're gonna check all the last rewards we haven't covered yet. Most of them are the same, but the Beast Claw Great Hammer is called Lion's Claw Great Hammer. In 1.0, Gronk's last dialogue is the same, but he's lacking the roar effect and just fades away. While in release, he gets dusted away. Now going into the Consecrated Snowfields proper, first thing I noticed is that it's actually playing the Mountaintops OST, I believe, instead of the Consecrated Snowfields. At night, the visibility isn't too bad in 1.0, and I kind of wish this was more what it is in release, because it's definitely really hard to explore this area overall. The daytime visibility is just as bad though as release, as far as I could tell. There's no Putrid Duelist in this coffin segment of the snowy area, so you don't get the drops that you normally get in current patch, because he's just not there. At the Consecrated Snowfields Catacombs, there's no Impad Elder. One of the pillar snow thingies goes to the stairway here, which actually turned out to be very dangerous, and something to keep an eye out if you're exploring this area. The Grave Duelist boss didn't remove his cloak until I got really close to him, so I guess his aggro thing is a little bit shorter in the boss room. The boss seemed the same. He did drop the Glove Ward, but he didn't drop the Rotten Gravekeeper Cloak, unfortunately. So as you can probably tell, we're getting a pattern here. Back outside, for the dual Night Cavalry boss fight, as opposed to the last one we fought, the Mountaintops, these ones do have proper boss health scaling, but they're still not boss health bars at the bottom. They are a nighttime boss, and as we've seen, those appear to not be counted as bosses per se. Instead of having to kill both of them so they'll drop everything that they have, the first one that you kill, the flail one, drop the set only, and when you kill the second one, he drops the Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone. So it works a little bit differently. You can actually just get whichever you need. Near where you find the Stalwart Horn Charm +1, there's no Ancestral Followers or Shaman, and what is supposed to be the Stalwart Charm is just Glintstone Flies in 1.0. So once again, another Talisman and another Horn Charm missing. The Stake of America at Yellow Ruins is broken. Don't use it. I was warned about this, but I literally forgot until the moment I was flying through the sky, as I reloaded through there. The Unendurable Frenzy incantation is called Frenzied's Firestorm. Going into the Yellow Annex Tunnel, the only difference I can find in the tunnel itself is that there's no Heroes Rune 5 in front of this Onyx Lord. But for the Astel fight, it has a lot of the same differences as the other Astel, like the meteorite opening and the color of the meteorites themselves. The song is Graveborn this time instead of the Astel song. But I noticed that the particle effects are different from the other Astel 1.0 as well. And I don't believe they're different due to the environment either. They do seem to have just straight up different kind of coloring particle effects. And he also has a whole new strategy. As you may know, this Astel has an additional attack that the other one doesn't in current patch, where he can summon a bunch of grayed out Astels to grab you at the same time when he teleports. And he still can't do that in this one, but in 1.0, those Grey Clones can actually appear at random and attack you, which is very jarring, and it does seem kind of unfair, but it was surprisingly easy to dodge and avoid them just by kind of panic rolling. It was kind of interesting. If they're trying to make it a spooky fight, it's good. If they weren't, it's not. It's just not good. The Sanguine Noble Invader drank one more flask than usual. Otherwise, the fight seemed the same. He still dropped the same things, but he also dropped a Cerulean Crystal tier, which in this character already had both, so I couldn't pick it up at all. It was just maxed out in my inventory. So I had to double check in another character, and yeah, sure enough, it drops one of them. Funnily enough, it's a pickup too. It's not like it's dropped into your inventory. And it does seem to be the left side, so do with wedding for what you will. Oh, and speaking of which, I did use one of the very old Snowfield skips from the Mountaintops to get this character there. So if you want to know, yes, those still work, which makes sense. At this tree here, the Smithing Stone 8 is replaced by a Rot Resin 1.0. At the Apostate Derelict, instead of the Silver Mirror Shield in front of Latina's sister, we find the Peldrake Talisman +2 here, which is supposed to be at the Haligtree. When bringing Latina to her sister, she spawns a lot further from her and starts talking immediately in 1.0. When in release, she spawns next to her, and she also gestures towards her sister at the end of the first set of dialogue, with no particle effect, when she's supposed to do it during in release. And in 1.0, she simply leaves the +10 Somber Stone where she was. When in release, she gives it to you mid-dialogue. For whatever reason, the regular +25 stone is separated from the rest. But now that we have all of them, here are what all the stone names are. We talked about this in the very beginning of the series, so there's tons of differences, but I decided to wait until the very end to show them all at once. You may have also noticed that the design of the +9 and +10 Somber Stones are the same, both showing the +10 design, when in release, +9 is different. Behind the Derelict, the Somber Smithing Stone 9 here is an Ascent Butterfly in 1.0. The explosive Ghost Flame is called Flames of Death. For some reason, Anastasia is already spawned in visually before you get invaded, but she then invades in properly in the same spot. I assume this is kind of like when they have a second face model of a boss underneath the map. Maybe they do that for NPC invaders as well, but she was just mistakenly spawned overground. She did not drop the Somber Smithing Stone though, so that was disappointing. She kind of doesn't have any reason to invade. In the Cave of the Forlorn, the only difference I could find here is that there's no Hero Rune 2. Which I started noticing that the Hero Runes are not in 1.0. So I'm starting to think that maybe these particular runes were added later in development to give you a bigger rune. The Misbegotten Crusader is called Aberrant Crusader, as you might expect. It is also playing for a mid of a foe 1 instead of Old Warriors. I noticed that the particle effect on the Established Order Ash of War is brighter in 1.0, where it's supposed to be a more gold hued in post-release. It also does the Erdtree and Crucible sigil instead of the Golden Order sigil, along with the location of our cast being different. Besides the Huge, there's no real difference with Theodorix, but there's no Ancient Dragon Smithing Stone behind him in the Ice Cliffs. Since that's the last dragon that gives us a spell, here are the final stock for both of the churches to have the dragon spells. If you want a more comprehensive list, you can look in the companion sheet. For the final northeast section of the Snowfield, the White Shadows lore Ash of War is called Illusory Lore in 1.0. At the top left of here, where you find the Grave Warden Duelist, it's not here again. So as you can probably guess, just the entire Rotten Grave Duelist set is not in this version. So it makes sense that these enemies were added later on, when they maybe gave the cloak to the boss, and then they added 2 more to fight. I noticed that the Albinaric woman would scream and stuff when they got hurt, which I didn't notice in the release version. I did notice that they do share a scream when they die, at least, for both versions. It's good voice acting, but it was a little horrifying, so I guess I'm not surprised they removed it. Speaking of the Albinaric woman, when they're riding the wolves, the frost spell that they do is actually a lot cooler because it has a spell sigil that pops up, but I don't believe it's one that's normally used in the game. I had a few suggestions. The one from Dark Souls 1, Miracle, seemed pretty close. It could definitely be the template for it at the very least, and maybe repeat it in the inner circle again to have different segments. I also had Demon Souls as a suggestion. I did check both the original and remake, but nothing comes as close as this one. I got a random Shamshir drop from an Albinaric frog enemy. As mentioned all the way in the beginning, the Shamshir isn't in its normal spot, so makes sense you can farm from these guys instead. There's no scarabs with a Somber 8 and Somber 9 in these rock outcrops here. Since I was sure some of you might be curious about this, I did go ahead and see if this is still a good farm spot for runes, and here's what I found. The Big Crow can still be baited off of the ledge from the other side of the map, but it drops 5,000 runes instead of 11k or so, as in post-release. So that drops half of what it normally does in current patch. But the Albinaric enemies actually drop about the same amount. Actually, it's slightly more. Now, as much as I would like to say that this is good news, because it can improve the Relic Sword farm, let's get a little bit ahead of ourselves and look at the weapon in 1.0. As you can see, the distance of the attack is pretty minimal. It doesn't travel nearly as far as it does in release. But you can still sort of use it for this farm still. It's just not as mindless. So you will have to move around a little bit to get all of them. And the run amount you get is not too bad. It's just not as good. These red Albinarics can use the discus attack, which I've been told shouldn't be the case. If you have seen it done in release, do let me know. You can still find blood tax in the same spot, but it's called Taker's Thrust. It still has the visual effect, but it doesn't seem to actually steal life. So I guess it's just repeating thrust right now. There's no more flies in this little cave, but we'll discuss that a little bit more later. Keep that in the back of your mind. The Hero's Rune 4 in this tree is a Numen's Rune, and the Hero's Rune 3 is an Antient's Rune 4. So we are getting some newer runes now. And I also want to mention that a lot of the blood excrement that you'll find as a highlighted item, the one with the blue-white light, aren't there. I didn't find any single one that's a lootable one like that. Only the ones that are on the ground that do respawn. Going into the Crow Hell area, I did still get invaded by the white mask dudes, but they seem to actually stand in place until you approach them instead of chasing you to the ends of the earth. This invader was still using the Blood Misericord, so that could mean that it's still somewhere in the game, or at least these NPCs programmed to have it, but it does have bad bleed buildup, to be honest. It didn't use blood tax at all. One of the later ones used a normal repeating thrust, Ash of War. This first invader dropped the Pauper's Rune, the literal Golden Rune 1 equivalent. The second invader didn't drop anything. And the third one also didn't drop anything. So there's no Surgeon set as far as I can tell. There's this little pathway that has an arterial leaf at the end. But for some reason in 1.0, there's more dogs defending it. That was really strange. There's only like 2 in current patch. And I fought like 5 or 6 in 1.0. It was weird. On the pathway to the palace, I didn't see anything different. Those red Albinarics still summon the skeletons and such. So nothing to comment on there. But before that, I'm going to go back to talk to Gideon and tell him about the Mohgwyn Palace. And it turns out he does still react to you finding it. The only difference I could find is he doubles up on a part of the dialogue.
A hidden treasure known only to me. A secret rite known only to me.
According to the FuturePress guide, this text changes depending on what info you bring him. So they just left these together by accident, I assume. But in these particular two, both of these were wrong actually. He still gave the Favre cookbook with the branch though, so still the same loot. Now actually on the way to the Mohgwyn Palace. The Numen's Rune here is an Antient's Rune 1. Just like in Altus Plateau, these bleed blobs don't disappear after death, they just kind of stay here. The blood rose in this corner is replaced by a Salo Ember, or the Yellow Ember equivalent. Here is the stock for the Mohgwyn Merchant, and as you might have seen, it has unlimited preserving boluses. I did go ahead and finish various quest stuff, so I used the Pureblood Knight's Medal, and it actually doesn't have any particle effects, it just shows the sigil, briefly. The summon sign, and when you invade into the world, it calls White Mask Vare, White Faced Vare. The only difference I could find is that he doesn't use blood tax, he also uses repeating thrust in 1.0. All the dialogue from the fight and after you beat him is the same, but he's the one that drops the swarm of flies. So this is how you get it. However, you can kill him for it at any point in the game. Doesn't have to be during this quest line, thankfully. Now going on to Mohg himself. For phase 1, it seemed pretty much identical to the Shunning Grounds fight. The only difference I found then was the missing fireball when he holds in his hand and explodes in front of you. It's the same here. Then the heal attack worked the same in general. The blood crystal tier does work the same. It still blocks the 3 knee heal attacks, and it still does a little bit of chip damage. I did notice that if he does kill you, he has an additional small little line at the end of his dialogue.
Miquella is mine and mine alone. For all eternity.
Honestly, this feels more complete to me. I don't know why they removed it, because it doesn't seem like it cut off too early or anything. Because yeah, this doesn't show in current patch, just the first bit. Now for phase 2, the tip of the trident's bleed particle effect does look a little bit different than it does in post-release. But that's really about it. I didn't find any other differences in the fight. I do want to say though, I don't think I got bled once in this fight. I don't think I came close to even getting bled. And I think in 1.0, bleed buildup is just not as strong. I kind of felt that all throughout exploring this area. I didn't really get bled once, I don't think. Besides the exploding cloud ones, but that's just impatience really. But given how strong bleed is, it might actually be more balanced. Mohgwyn's Sacred Spear doesn't need or scale with Arcane apparently. That's pretty OP. Blood Boon is called Blood Flame of the Dynast, and it also doesn't need an Arcane, which is interesting. I assume maybe that's the same for the other Blood Flame stuff, and I hadn't noticed until now. And I did talk to Gideon again. Everything was exactly the same. He still gets the Law of Causality. Now going into Ordina. The Ordina Liturgical Town Grace is called Ordina City of Ceremony in 1.0. There's a random Crimson Scarab that's not normally here in release, kind of to the top right of where the jail is. There's no Black Knife set in its normal spot, because apparently you have to actually farm it from the enemies. In release, these Black Knife and the actual jail only drop glove warts, which are missable if you finish the place and don't kill them or whatever, and they don't respawn. So they're technically missable if you don't kill them or whatever, but you know, it's just glove warts. You can get more of those. And sure enough, they do drop their set. Now normally that'll be fine, but just like in post-release, they do despawn after you kill them once, and you can just finish this area. But if you finish this area, you can't go back there. Now in fairness, after going through this area again, I was able to get a bunch of the armors to drop in spades. So if you just use all the item discovery boosting items, it might be possible you can get all of them. But still, it is still a little bit dumb. You can potentially use that on this set. Some of the Albinauric women here have purple bows and arrows instead of blue, but not all of them. Some just have the regular bows in general. I noticed that the Albinauric bow is called Silver Bow in 1.0. And lastly, the most important change of the entire snowfield, there's no cured meat in the stairway. That's it. Whenever I loaded in, it started off playing the Limgrave theme for a second or two. And then it switched to the Miquella's Haligtree track. And this does seem to happen every time I reloaded, so it's just a bug in the area. There's no stone sword key right next to the grace in this branch. We already noted that there's no Oracle envoys in Leyndell, but they are here as they usually are. The only difference is that their bows are actually blue, like the Clayman, instead of gold. And after killing some, it doesn't seem like they dropped the white flesh in this version. As for the bubbles, the same goes for the large envoys, they're also blue. There's no My Beloved carving, so it seems like the only carving in the game is the Year Beautiful one. The giant envoy dropped his great horn, but it was a random drop still. I did double check afterwards. Speaking of which, those giant envoys do have blue bubbles as well. Going down this branch, the Newman's rune is in explosive clumps in 1.0. In this little segment, all of the envoys seem a lot weaker for some reason. I was able to one or two shot all of them. But surprisingly, the Oracle envoy ashes are still there. And lastly, for the branch segment, there's no lost Ash of War here, near the statue. Over in the Haligtree town, there's no Pale Drake Talisman +2, but we did already collect that one in the Consecrated Snowfields. It just wasn't replaced by anything, it seems. There's no Somber 9 in this little segment. The Battle Mage's normal Pew Pew spell are a different color, like some other things we've seen in this game. When I killed one, it dropped the Haima Glintstone Crown, although it's called the Haima Stone Mask, when that's supposed to be a set drop from an enemy in Altus. And as mentioned, Meteorite Staff can be dropped from any of these. The Smithing Stone 8 is replaced by an Albinauric Blood Clot, and there's no Hero's Rune 4 in this platform. At the beginning of every fight, Loretta always seems to kind of side hop, usually into the wall, just kind of spans up for a while until you get close enough to her. So that's something. In phase 1, she can use the normal bow attack, which normally shouldn't be possible, and release anyway. When she does Loretta's Mastery, the spell has like a triangle shape instead of just being a straight line, and it does kind of home straight at you. When killed, she still dropped her spell, but she did not drop the War Sickle. And you may notice that the Mastery's icon is a little bit different. It has 3 arrows instead of 4. But whenever I shot the spell, it seemed normal. It still had the 4 arrows. And the grace that spawns when you kill her is called Arbor Sentinel Promenade instead of Haligtree Promenade. After Loretta, there's also no chest with the ancient stone in it. Going into Alfell, the Miquella's Haligtree song is still playing in this segment instead of switching over to the proper Alfell OST, and it did seem to have the same Limgrave bug as well. I didn't find any exploding foot soldiers in Alfell. There wasn't any at the beginning, but across the whole level I didn't see any of them. Just a couple of normal foot soldiers. The Miquella Knight Sword has an int requirement instead of faith, and it does magic damage instead of holy as well. The Escher War is square off instead of Sacred Blade, but it does still have the same R2s as normal. The triple Rings of Light are called Miquella's Rings of Light. If that name sounds familiar, it's because the Cleanrot Knight's is Halo Scythe. That's what the Escher War is called. The Seedbed Curse is where the Somber Ancient Zone is supposed to be, around the corner, which makes more sense here, to be honest, than being out in the open. But the Somber isn't where the Seedbed will turn out to be, it's just empty. The Putrid Avatar in the bridge does not drop the Rotten Staff, although it turns out it's not a set drop, because you can actually get it randomly. And the staff is called the Hammer of Rot instead. The golden rune that's supposed to be outside of the Marika Sourceal room is actually inside it in 1.0. Revenants don't drop glove wards, or at least it's a lot more inconsistent. The second closest Crystallian in this dark room just kind of tanked my hits until his posture broke. It didn't really react, but then after breaking it did start fighting back. For some reason there's a blue Crystallian in this room as well, and he's holding both the spear and the chakram things. This one's an enigma. Firstly, he tries throwing the small chakrams but nothing happens. Secondly, he still spins with a spear in his hand, so this one clearly has the moveset of the chakram one. Thirdly, yep, you can't hurt me. And lastly, look how much damage my fists do. So yeah, this one's just an incredibly weird, misplaced enemy that wasn't programmed right, it seems to me. Either that or it was a troll by Miyazaki. Who knows with that guy? The Smithing Stone 8 here is a root resin 1.0. There's no Spare Flame arrows in this room right here. And there's also no Haligtree Soldier Ashes. If you approach the bridge before the Avatar, the enemies start running to you instead of shooting the ballistas, when they do shoot you in other situations. Instead of there being Haligtree Knights next to the Avatar, there's Cleanrot Knights. The Avatar does not drop a Lord's Rune, there's no Sacramental Bud next to where the Avatar was, and there's no Haligtree Knight Helm either. Before we proceed, since we have all 5 Seedbed Curses now, the only one that seemed missing is the Blackguard's one. I did go to do Dung Eater's questline thing, and everything seemed the same. You still get the Mending Rune as well. Although I did notice he freaked out on me when I triggered the dialogue. There's no chest with the Rotten Crystal Sword in it next to these Crystallians. The Hero's Rune 5 here next to this Chalice is Smoldering Butterflies instead in 1.0. There's no Kindred of Rot enemy when dropping down to this little corner with the item in the Rot Lake, which thank God. And the item itself is Poison Stone Clump in 1.0 instead of Rod Grease. You can do Millicent's quest without killing the Tree Spirit, which is very appreciated. When doing the Helping Millicent sign, the gold one, she's the one that has the red hue instead of her sisters. But overall, this encounter was insane. This might single-handedly be the most frustrating thing I've had to do in Elden Ring. They all do a ton of damage, especially with the Ashes of War, and they all seem to prioritize you if you get too close to them. Millicent is far more useless, she doesn't do nearly enough damage, she doesn't seem to be able to heal herself, and she's very prone to falling off the map. I ended up just cheesing them Althea's Mist, which I don't think you can do in current patch, but I seriously couldn't be bothered. I tried them for an hour and was not even close to killing them, when I first tried them in current patch. You probably have to try it yourself to believe it's harder, even though it seems the same at the surface, but it's not worth it, and I'm so happy that it was fine-tuned at launch. On a brighter note, the Rotted Winged Swords insignia is called Accessory Name, so we got another kind of placeholder name. I did test the damage increase, so it does seem to be corresponding to the talisman. It's just not a finished item. Oh, and you may also notice that hitting the turtle pulp is different. And apparently it just turns into a normal turtle after you hit him. It just starts walking around. Going back to Gowry, you can press to talk on him, but he doesn't say anything. If you do the red Millicent sign to fight her, there's only one sister as normal, but she's also fighting you instead of Millicent. Typical co-invader. There doesn't even seem to be friendly fire, so that was silly. I noticed afterwards that you still had access to the gold sign when you don't have access to the red one if you did gold first in 1.0. I did do it and I still got the reward, meaning that I got both alternate rewards in one character, meaning you should fight Millicent first if you want to get both. This Hero Runes 5 is a Hero's Rune. In the room right next to Millennius' Grace, there's no Aeonia Flower here, nor the Traveler's set, but there's still a couple of butterflies around, albeit fewer. Now onto Millennia herself. When you die to her, she has an additional line of dialogue that she doesn't in post-release.
Now do you understand? I am Melania, Blade of Miquella.
The same thing happened with Mohg, and just like in his case, I actually think this sounds more complete with a full line there. I can't exactly see why I decided to cut it. This seems perfectly reasonable to have that there. One of the variants of the 4-hit combo just doesn't have sparks on the prosthetic. Very minor detail that was pointed out to me. Here's both side by side to see the comparison. Malenia can do waterfall dance right from the beginning. It was one of the first moves she did for me in one of the attempts. You seem to still be able to dodge the beginning of it if you surround her and maybe roll at the end. Dodging the second set can sometimes clip you at the very end if you dodge backwards. And the third set, you can't just walk towards her and dodge. She seems to track you much more heavily. So that was the hardest part to figure out for this old waterfowl. I didn't really figure it out at all, I would say, but I'm also no Malenia expert. I tried using the freezing and bleed pots to stagger her out of waterfowl, but didn't seem to work, like in post-release. And apparently she has an entirely cut attack, which is a walking waterfall dance. It looks very janky, so I'm not surprised they cut it. Perhaps they didn't have time to polish it. But even if that wasn't the case, it's a little bit extra to have 2 sets of the same attack. That could also be the reason they cut it. It's not nearly as hard to dodge as the normal one, but it can be a little inconsistent. Mind you, I didn't get to practice it a lot. But it does seem like if you have time to run away from it, that does help avoid it for the most part. For phase 2, she can do the Scarlet Aeonia attack immediately after having done the first one. Doesn't matter what HP she's at. Her waterfall dance in this phase does not cause Scarlet Rot buildup. During her Phantom attack, she lunges at you before the last Phantom strikes itself, so it's a little bit tricky if you're used to the post-release version. And she can still do the walking waterfall as well, in phase 2. When you beat her, Malenia's death dialogue gets all dumped to you at once her HP reaches 0, instead of being broken into 2 parts, before and after you receive the rewards, but the actual dialogue is the same. She still leaves behind the wilted flower, and you can still get a Miquella's needle, except you'll get a normal ancient dragonstone instead of a somber one. Going to check Malenia's rewards, Hand of Malenia is called the Hand of Malenia in 1.0, but aside from that, it has a lot less dex requirements. Not talking to Gideon about the whole Haligtree situation. The alternating dialogue is still off, like in Mohgwyn. He did give the Black Flames protection, but it's called Protector of the Godslayer. And for the last reward, the dialogue was iffy again, and Lord's Divine Fortification was called Guiding Divine Fortification in 1.0. After doing this, if you talk to him again, he has no more dialogue prompts since everything's complete now. But in post-release, he does normally have just a brief dialogue with you before not talking to you anymore. The cutscene that plays to introduce Farum Azula does have the red lightning striking around the area in 1.0. In post-release, there is a ton of lightning shooting all over the place, even with sound effects and everything, but it doesn't have either of that in 1.0. Crumbling Farum Azula is called Doomed Farum Azula in 1.0, which maybe is just my inner edgelord, but I kind of like that more than Crumbling. It definitely speaks more to its fate, I think, than Crumbling. Just like at the Haligtree, the beginning of the Limgrave theme starts playing whenever the music fires up for the area, before it plays the proper track for Crumbling Farum Azula. Where at the beginning of Farum Azula, the Smithing Stone 8 is Living Jar Shards in 1.0. Before the dragon swoops down, the Smithing Stone 8 is Lightning Grease. The dragon fights seem pretty much the same, but he didn't drop the Ancient Mithing Stone upon death. And then right behind there, the Smithing Stone 8 here is a Gravity Stone fan. In the ceiling of the Beast Grave Depths, there's no Gravastone in this little altar. The Great Grave Glovewort is replaced by Compound Stones here, which is the equivalent of Gravastone, so perhaps they just moved that from here to the other side in current patch. While I was fighting the lightning casting beastmen, I noticed that the delay lightning attack that they do doesn't really have a sound effect whenever they're in the ground. And the sound effect they do when it fires off is fairly weak compared to how dangerous it really is. Here's how it sounds normally. It's a subtle effect, but it's just enough to let you know that you're in danger, I would say. Apparently, Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strikes is called Wrath of the Ancient Drakes, and Ancient Dragon's Lightning Spear is called Ancient Dragon Bolt. The style requirements seem the same, but the FP cost for the Lightning Spear seems almost double in 1.0. Going from the Tempest facing Balcony Grace, the dragon over the areas that you traverse through here is not only awake, but he shoots down fire at you from above. I have heard that he is supposed to fire lightning at you from up there. At least I heard that when I was playing my first playthrough, but I never actually had that happen myself, so this was definitely a surprise either way for me. This altar with the Great Grave Glovewort is a Smithing Stone 8 in 1.0. Going on to the Dragon Temple where the gods can duo are, there is no Dragon Wound Grease here in this ledge. There's also no Rune Arc here. There is no Azula Beastmen Ashes, but we actually already have them. We found them in Caelid. And this Somber 9 is an exclusive Stone Clumps, near the Azula Beastmen Ashes. And lastly, for the major glitches I can think of, the move swap that you can use to cross distances in the air without torrent can still be done. There's a few ways to do it, but this is the one I'm familiar with, so that's the one I'm showing. I didn't actually make it towards the bridge because I'm bad. It's probably still possible, but even if not, you can see the distance you cover is still huge, so it should still be very useful. Now going on to the Godskin duo themselves, but now Summon Sign wasn't there, but apparently the summon was added in a later patch, so yeah, that makes sense. For the boss fight itself, the only difference I noticed is that they seem to have less HP individually, because the total health bar only went down to about 30% when both were killed instead of around half, like in current patch. I did some math. To kill the first apostle, it took 5,733 damage in 1.0, but the full HP bar was less depleted than normal. And to kill the same one, it took 6,863 in current patch, roughly 1,000 HP more, but of course the HP bar was more depleted. This means that you need to kill more duo spawns overall to defeat them 1.0, but they each have less HP individually. And at Borderline, I feel like that's more balanced. You could be more strategic in your bursts of DPS in order to kill one, and then potentially take out the other one before the respawns as well. I also noticed that if I killed both too fast, they respawn the last one you just killed indefinitely. Meaning that if you killed a noble last, and the other one hadn't respawned yet, it would actually respawn the noble right away. And then the same thing but with the apostle. I had this situation happen for both of the different characters, instead of kind of alternating between the noble and apostle. Either that or it's completely random and I just got incredibly lucky both times. Mind you, usually only kill 4 Godskins or so to beat the boss in post-release, so it may not be as clear if that's the case in there too. One thing I noticed at a later point is that if you have the Mimic tier during this fight, and you do kill both of them at the same time, so the fight is temporarily halted, your Mimic tier will actually just go away. I guess it assumes that the fight is done when it's obviously not. I'm not sure if this is possible in other fights. This one's a fairly unique one, so perhaps it doesn't have the chance to do so. But yeah, it's a unique interaction I noticed in this one. When killed, they still drop Black Flame Tornado and the bell, but Black Flame Tornado is called Flame Tornado only. Now going past the Dragon Temple altar, the weapons of the Beastmen have a yellow lightning effect on them instead of the red one. On the floating rock bridge where the shield talisman +2 is, you get shot at by lightning as you cross. Well, I've never had this happen in current patch, but eventually realized why. There's this Beastman enemy overlooking you at the opposite side of the bridge that is shooting at you. Of course, I investigated this in current patch and turns out that the enemy is in the same spot and is trying to shoot lightning at you, but is just landing where he's standing instead. When I reached the end of the bridge in current patch, one of the lightning attacks did reach me finally. Perhaps you're ahead of me on this, but this is my working theory. FromSoft scripted this very specific ambush, but eventually realized that the range of these enemies is a bit ridiculous, especially in other areas. We'll have another encounter later in the video that'll prove this more directly. So they decided to nerf the enemy overall significantly, but didn't account for this ambush being changed, so they just kinda messed it up. Because even in 1.09 he still tries to shoot you, but it just lands where he is, which is what happens to you when you're locked onto an enemy and try to do something like Rain of Arrows, but you're too far from the effective range and you just shower yourself instead. This is only my theory, but I think it's a satisfactory explanation, even if it's not quite what happened. And as someone who would like to make games one day, to see a scripted ambush that seemingly got botched by accident, and they either haven't noticed or decided to ignore for now is interesting. But I was fascinated by this, so I figured it's something that you'll find interesting as well, especially if you're watching this series. Over in the Dragon Temple Lift side area, this Smithing Stone 8 is replaced by a Gravity Stone chunk. That's the second situation like this, replaced by a Gravity Stone specifically. Alexander still shows up for the end of his quest line, but he's surrounded in a gold summon queue for some reason. I did actually notice this as I was approaching the area because you can see it from far away. At one point, he actually finishes his entire dialogue before attacking you, instead of starting mid-dialogue. When you beat him, he doesn't shatter instantly, so you don't get jump scared as intensely in 1.0 apparently. When I saw his drops, at first I thought he gave both shards, but only the Alexander's remains is a talisman. The Shard of Alexander equivalent, presumably. The other one is the Innards equivalent, Alexander's core, which from my understanding, Jarbaron's quest isn't even in the day 1 patch. I was added in a patch later on, so this is presumably useless for now. If you kill him early in the game, you get the core as well. Doesn't seem like it drops the smaller version of the talisman, but obviously not the Innard equivalent. Going forward a little bit from where Alexander was, I couldn't pick up the Ancient Dragon cookbook because there seemed to be a dupe of this here, so I must have got it at some point prior already. And around from that area with the cookbook, there's a little drop where there's normally a Smithing Stone 8, but it's not there in 1.0. While we're in the side path, I want to quickly look at the imbued stone key warp from the Belfries to Farum Azula. Whenever you warp in, you don't actually get the area pop up, so it doesn't spoil you where you are, I suppose. Which I kind of like. It makes this a lot more mysterious, and you won't have the map if you come here really early, so. There's a different track playing here from the Crumbing Farum Azula one, which is what should be playing. And it turned out to be the Limgrave nighttime track. The daytime one can play here as well if you just happen to come, I assume, in what the game considers daytime. And the Peldrake's talisman was still there, which we actually have all three, surprisingly. Over in the Dragon Temple rooftops, killing the dragon does not drop the Ancient Smithing Stone. Instead, it is where the Somber Ancient Stone is, but that does mean that the Somber is now missing, as I couldn't find anywhere else. By the way, this is how many of all the max stones we got for each of them, after having explored everything in the game but this level and the Ashen Capital. And I've only used one of each so far, so it's safe to say that this game is a lot more stingy about max level upgrades before launch. And the little segment where there's the 2 banished knights after a ladder, there's no dragon tower shield in this chest. First time in a while where we have an empty chest, actually. Going over to the Great Bridge, Brunel still invades before the Overlord Talisman. He seems to cast Protection of the Urchin instead of Golden Vow 1.0. But apparently he doesn't drop his armor in this situation, only the claw and the scepter. But if you kill him in the War Master shack, you can get his armor then, although it's called Menagerist armor. So it's definitely a little bit icky for me. It means that you either do his questline, which unlocks a couple of things. For instance, he has a couple of extra items in Volcano Manor, and then also his invasion rewards. Or you get his armor by killing him early. So you do kind of have to decide which one you want more. When using the Blasphemous Claw, the effect surrounding it is different. And the Overlord's Talisman is still there and it seems to have the same effect. The Drake armor is still here and seems the same, but the set actually mentions an NPC that is never mentioned in post-release, I believe. It's called Ondrej, the Dragon Tracker. Pronunciation may vary. If you run to the Placidusax area without killing enemies, you can actually get a good preview of how far the range of the lightning casting beastman is. It'll keep following me till I'm almost near at the platform where you have to go to a Placidusax itself. Which is a point for what I was talking about earlier. If they can really shoot you from all the way up there, and possibly without having you in view, their range is pretty ridiculous. Not that it's much of an issue, but it is pretty ridiculous. When laying down to get transported to Placidusax, it does take slightly longer for the cutscene to go through for 1.0. But now to the fight itself. The fire that Placidusax shoots is normally a pure goldish tint, but it has like a greenish hue at times in 1.0, I've noticed. The music doesn't pause whenever he's doing the super nuke attack. I feel like I might have noticed that it actually does maybe change the volume of it slightly, but it's definitely not nearly as powerful as it is in post-release. Here's how it sounds normally. You also may have noticed that there's no real indicator on the ground of roughly how far the explosion will go in 1.0, where in post-release there is something kind of like that. And the riposte indicator when you stance break it is red instead of yellow, which I don't think I've seen that in the series, so that's definitely interesting. Placidusax Ruins is called Placidusax Judgment. Now going on to Malekith. First thing you'll notice that the alternate dialogue that you get if you do Grong's quest is still there, but I did double check both sets of dialogue, whether you've done it or not. For 1.0, they all seem exactly the same, so nothing to comment on there. As you may have noticed already, the Beast Clergyman is called Beast Pastor instead. One thing that stood out to me right away is that some of the attacks are animated differently, especially these little sweep attacks. And I'm a bit conflicted on this. I like how they look a little more smoother. I don't tend to like really snappy attack animations like that. It makes it a little hard to telegraph what's going on. But you can tell it's definitely a little bit unpolished too, so I'm not sure if I prefer it or not. The Beast Claw attacks were earthquakes instead, both of them. Now going on to phase 2. The music then transitioned to the second part of the soundtrack, neither during the cutscene or the actual start of phase 2. The track just stayed in the phase 1 part. The slam down attack is animated differently as well in here. This one I don't have a preference for one or the other. I kind of like both of them for its own reasons. I believe this is a famous change, but there's some purple particle effect showing at the very end of some of his super attacks, like the wind slashes, the spin attack at the end of the 4 projectile combo, and the earthquake. Although in this one, it doesn't actually have the earthquake, it's just the explosion when he lands. There's no second delayed attack. Speaking of the wind slash attack as well, it's hard to tell if the AoE overall is bigger or it's moved back more. But as you can see, it covers more of Malekith's body than it does in post-release when it's mostly just the head area. So that makes it a little harder to dodge into him for this attack in particular. At one point, he staggered himself with the boulders from phase 1. That was quite funny. I don't know if that can happen in current patch, but it's just something that happened. And he also got stuck in a pillar at one point too, which can happen in post-release. The only difference is that then it would actually warp to the center of the arena to reposition itself, where in 1.0 it doesn't do anything, you just stay stuck. So you have to either kill him like that or die, which can be harder than you'd expect. After killing him, in 1.0 it actually took a lot longer for the screen to fade to black than in current patch, so kind of like the Placidusax cutscene earlier. But then the cutscene after was exactly the same. Malekith's Black Blade, Escher War is called Destined Death Unbound instead of just Destined Death in 1.0. And since we're on the round table real quick, I want to point out that Rodrika, whenever she moves back to the center of the round table, will have her cloak back on, even though in release she will normally just have it off already if she's a tuner. But obviously this is just the exact same model and position that she's in the beginning of the game before she's a tuner in 1.0. The little pathway that normally leads you to the Avenue Balcony in normal Leyndell, there's no Tarnished Sunflower in 1.0. Corrin's dialogue is the same before you go meet Gold Mask, but even after you do so, he never actually dies, so I just took care of myself. There's nothing to comment on really. The Gold Mask corpse does have the Mending Rune of Perfect Order, but he does not drop the Gold Mask set. We never found the actual mask, so I didn't really expect to find it here, but I did make sure by reloading and stuff. The ancient Somber Stone near the Gargoyle is still there, thankfully. There's no Hero's Rune 4 equivalent in these rooftops. And I did double check the Crimson Ember Medallion +2 and the dropped into the sewers, it was still there. And same goes for the Erdtree Favor +2 when you come from the Forbidden Lands. I didn't comment on either of those. One thing that I did find really interesting though, is that upon checking the Tower of Return, the chest actually is deactivated. At first I thought it was because I already had used it prior to the Erdtree burning, but it turns out in a different character, without me having taken this chest yet, it was still open already. Meaning that the game actually doesn't want you to go here after the Ashen Capital segment. So naturally, out of curiosity, I actually glitched myself up there with the Pegasus glitch. And I found out that the entire area is more or less white. They actually don't want you to be here anymore. Even if you haven't got the Talisman or gotten Melania's Great Rune, they still just made it impossible to get here naturally. Funnily enough though, the elevator actually was still operational, so I was able to go down there. But there's not really anything to comment on. The only thing I noticed that's interesting is that you can actually use Torrent down here for some reason, when you normally can't in the Ashen Capital. Either way, this was fixed for a release version. Obviously, you can still come here afterwards by going to the Tower Return. But if you're planning to do open up playthrough, just keep that in mind. Going towards the Gideon fight, the fight begins immediately and he actually is talking to you as you start fighting. The background song is Godfrey's theme,
To become Elden Lord.
when normally it's playing the Ymir, and that includes the change to phase 2 whenever you get Gideon to have health. Funny enough, you can actually interrupt Gideon's dialogue if you just hit him. But I did double check in a different character and the dialogue is the same. In 1.0 he uses 2 flask heals instead of 1. The Law of Causality pops off instantly if it's procced, meaning that it's a lot more dangerous as you can't dodge it. Well, it's kind of neat in a way. That also means that if you don't want to get hit, you either gotta play passively or attack from range, which is easier said than done in most cases. If you die, he doesn't have any dialogue. And it turns out that there's no Stake of America for him, so you have to run back all the way from the capital of Ashgrace. His dying dialogue gets cut off at random points. The farthest I was ever able to get to was this bit.
Cannot kill.
But it gets cut off just a bit early. But it does appear a little bit random. It sometimes got cut off earlier. And if you get too far away from him, he actually gets cut off that way, which is kind of neat for the speedrunning sense, but yeah. Just quickly going to the chambers. Erdtree Heal is named Golden Heal in 1.0. Not going on to Godfrey or Horlu. Godfrey can do a little run in phase 1 when he doesn't seem to in release version. Minor detail doesn't mean much, but it was pointed out to me. If you do die in phase 1, he has an additional line at the very end of his taunt.
Tarnished warrior, 'twas nobly fought. Thy rest is well deserved.
Going on to phase 2, however, you might notice that he's still in phase 1 after getting his health down all the way. And that's because he actually just has a hidden health bar for phase 2, kind of like Melania and such. There was some contention about what this means for how much HP he actually has, so I did the math, and he doesn't have double HP. In release, he normally has almost 22,000, and at one point he had above 30,000. So the easiest way you can put it is that he has 1.5 times the amount of HP in each phase. And yeah, technically means that it's harder in 1.0. The phase 2 earthquakes don't have the eruption effect. It just has a lot of rocks going up and down. I guess it makes more sense. I'm not really sure why Godfrey can summon eruptions out of the ground in phase 1, but that's how it is in this version. After you kill him, he actually has an additional laugh at the end of his dialogue that was cut in later versions.
Tarnished, thy strength befits same crown.
We don't get the best read on his personality, so it's hard to say if this is in character or not. He seems very serious for the fight, pretty much. But it is his last words, I guess, so who knows. Checking his remembrance, the Regal Roar is called either Regal Stomp or Divine Quake, depending on which menu you're looking at. The Axe of Godfrey has little rocks coming out of the ground, which makes sense depending on the part of the fight, I guess. Now going on to final boss duo. For Radagon, the stone platform prompt pops up whenever you load it into the fight after the cutscene, which normally doesn't even show after the boss fight. It only shows if you warp in or reload after you beat him, and you still haven't chosen an ending. Besides that though, there's literally no change to Radagon that I could tell. Even the particle effects were pretty close as far as I could tell. If I had to make a stretch, to me it seemed like he's not as prone to parrying your projectiles as much. From what I could tell, it seems like he has to put out his hand in front of him to be able to parry. Now going on to the LLB segment, there's no music playing during the boss fight transition cutscene, so you get to listen to a lot of interesting sound effects. The dives that it does to get away from you will actually hurt you if you're too close, and push you back. It is hurt a lot, mind you, but it's something you would want to dodge, in this version at least. The boundaries of the boss arena aren't shown in a vague white fog when you reach them, they're completely invisible, which makes it really bad. The Wave of Gold attack is much further reaching, which is ironic, given the Astral War change. Apparently you can cast multiple Elden Stars, and having them running around at the same time, which is just my nightmare. I had 3 going at once at one point, but the first one exploded before the third one could start being a problem at least. That's all for the very distinct changes, but I do want to say that this fight overall is much harder at 1.0. If you were there at launch, you might have remembered that a lot of people hated this boss fight, and a lot of people still do, but one thing is that this fight has been made easier over time, or at least less annoying. I don't know if there's any one particular patch that made it easier or not, but playing the current release version and going back to 1.0 is a very good way to just see how different it really is. The main thing I can point to is that it'll do a lot of these attacks that create a lot of distance between you two, even as you're trying to close that gap, so there's just a lot of time spent trying to run after him, and just generally not a lot of openings to hit him. Along with that, I felt like a lot of the projectiles do a lot more damage, like all the stars that fly at you at the same time, or the Elden Stars itself. So for whatever reason you want to experience what it was like at release, more or less, this is a good way to test that, especially if you tried the release version and 1.0 back to back. The God Slain pop-up, it's a lot faster to come up, and you get warp very fast with very little fanfare overall. If you reload in the stone platform, the Limgrave theme will start playing, because of course, why wouldn't it? But it does go after a little bit, as some of the prior areas. The Sacred Relic sword design display in 1.0 is slightly darker. Now as for the endings, I did verify all of them, and besides the snappier transition in some parts of the cutscenes of any of the Elden Lord variations,
The fallen leaves tell a story of how a tarnished became Elden Lord. In our home, across the fog, the lands between. Our seed will look back upon us and recall.
aside from that, literally all 6 endings are the same in their visuals and dialogue, including Goth Melody and such. I did test out Miquella's Needle for the Lord of Frenzy Flame version, and it did work. I no longer got the prompt for the Frenzy Flame after I came back. The thing I did notice though is that the eyes remain. In current patch, the burn marks do remain because it is just part of your body now, but the eyes usually get reverted back. But at 1.0, for whatever reason, the eyes stay the same even if you don't have that ending anymore. As for the ending credits, it plays a different version of the Godskin Apostle theme. At certain points, the same song will play from the beginning, but stack over the one that's currently playing. There'll even be points where you can hear the first song end, but it'll still be playing music because there's just another one playing over it. It's really silly. I will play the song in full at the end of the video, so you can listen to the whole thing if you want. When the credits ended, the song never truly ends, it just kind of abruptly cuts, and it shows the New Game Plus dialogue thing. The last thing I noticed is that if you approach or warp into the Elden Throne Grace after beating the game, you get sent instantly to the Round Table Hold for some reason. Perhaps there's something to do with the fact that some of the endings actually take place at that throne, but in post-release it doesn't happen at all. This is definitely some kind of bug. I did get around to comparing all the soul names and popped all of them to get a count of what they are, and I'll be showing them all right now. Apparently I never got an Antien's Rune 2, I'm not sure if I missed it or anything in 1.0, but just due to the process of elimination, I was able to deduce the name obviously. And every single rune was a 1-to-1 match from release, meaning that they all gave them the same rune amount, or the corresponding one in 1.0 to current patch, so I could also fill in the Antien's Rune 2. And so that means the only difference between these are the names. There's no difference from post-release to 1.0 as far as runes are concerned. Even the design of all of them seem to be pretty much identical. As I stated in the beginning of the video, the magic number I theorized on was 53 days. 53 days for From Software to implement most of these changes I discussed in this video, minus the ones that came out a few patches later, which are relatively minimal. According to this article, From Software had 300 developers to work on Elden Ring and Armored Core 6, which perhaps might make it feasible. Let me know what you think, especially if you have insight into this field. I will say that the 1.0 version was still somewhat impressive. It's just nice to see how complete the game actually was. A good portion of the changes were polished, rather than completely unfinished. However, I am a boomer at heart, and would prefer if the game was already complete once it was printed. But I understand that this is likely a necessary evil in most cases. All in all, this was a nice glimpse into the development of this game. And well, it allowed me to make this series, which I'm thankful for. So with that said, thank you all for sticking through the end of the video, for your patience as it took eons to put this together, and for the support throughout this entire series. I hope that you enjoyed. This series definitely brought my channel to new heights, and got me more exposure than I could ever hope for. It even got briefly featured in the Rusty video, which was a pleasant surprise. As for the future of these kinds of videos, I do have some knowledge about the rest of the Soulsborne games' 1.0 versions, and I certainly think they'll be worth their own series, especially as I do already own the guides for some of them. The one I'm most familiar with is Demon's Souls Remake, so I'm already determined to make a video for that one. Hopefully later this year, although it'll likely just be one video. I don't think it warrants multiple parts like this one. But do feel free to let me know what game you'd be interested in seeing covered in this fashion. Oh, and just in case you don't know, there won't be a 1.0 DLC. That's not really a thing. The best I could do is compare the initial release of the DLC to later patches, especially when they stop patching the game, which maybe I will do eventually, if the changes are great enough, but do expect DLC content once that's out. If you'd like to support me, the best way to do so is simply to spread and recommend this video out to as many places you think is appropriate, and subscribing of course. I would say watching the video to the end as well, but you've basically already done that if you're here. For financial support, I do have memberships open, and I do intend to open super chats and all that soon. Hopefully it will be by the time this is out. I will likely do a comparison and analytical content of Elden Ring that isn't 1.0 for a while, as a break. I haven't done anything else for about 4 months. But if there's plenty of support for this video and the series, I will definitely return to it I'll definitely return to it sooner rather than later. Regardless, thank you ahead of time for everything and anything you choose to do. For anyone who actively helped me by commenting changes that I missed throughout the series, this is for you. Hope to see you around. Bye bye.